Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through a creaking wooden door and straight into the streets of 1600s London. A city of 500,000 souls crammed into a space that would barely hold a modern suburb, where the air tastes of coal smoke and something worse, where your neighbours can hear every whisper through the thin plaster walls, and where simply surviving to see your 40th birthday makes you one of the lucky ones. You probably won't survive this, honestly. The plague is lurking around every corner, the water will give you dysentery, and that charming fellow offering to cure your toothache might just kill you with his rusty pliers. But don't worry, you're only visiting, and I'll be your guide through every grimy, fascinating, surprisingly human detail of daily life in Stuart London. So, before you get comfortable, just take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing that someone in Tokyo and someone in Toronto might be drifting off to sleep together, connected by these strange old stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and for a moment, you have absolutely no idea where you are. The darkness is total, not the partial darkness of a modern bedroom with its glowing phone chargers and standby lights, but a thick velvety blackness that seems to press against your face like a damp cloth. You blink and slowly your surroundings begin to emerge from the gloom. A faint grey light is seeping through the cracks in the wooden shutters, and you realise with a sinking feeling that morning has arrived in 17th century London. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's not a single smell, but a complex symphony of odours that your 21st century nose is entirely unprepared for. There's wood smoke from the fire that burned down to embers sometime in the night, mixing with the mustiness of old straw from the mattress beneath you. There's the sharp tang of unwashed bodies, yours included, you realise, and underneath it all a persistent note of something organic and unsettling that you'd rather not investigate too closely. Historians still argue whether people in this era simply didn't notice these smells, or whether they developed a kind of olfactory blindness as a survival mechanism. But either way, you're going to have to get used to it. You're lying on what passes for a bed in a middling London household, a wooden frame strung with ropes to support a mattress stuffed with straw, or, if your fictional family has done reasonably well, perhaps wool or even feathers. The sheets are linen, rough against your skin, and they haven't been washed in longer than you'd like to think about. Laundry is a massive undertaking in this world. It requires hauling water, heating it over a fire, scrubbing with harsh lye soap, and then finding somewhere to dry everything in a city where clean air is a fantasy. Most households manage a proper wash perhaps once a month, and sheets are changed even less frequently. But here's the thing that really strikes you as your eyes adjust. You are not alone in this bed. The concept of a private bedroom is a luxury that most Londoners simply cannot afford. The room you're in, and you use the term room generously because it's really more of a partitioned space within the larger house, contains your bed, which you're sharing with at least one other person, possibly more. If you're a servant, you might be sleeping at the foot of your master's bed or in a trundle that slides underneath it during the day. If you're a child, you're almost certainly piled in with your siblings, arranged like sardines to conserve warmth. The idea that everyone deserves their own sleeping space is a modern invention, and here in the 1600s, warmth, safety, and simple economics all argue for togetherness. The house around you is a timber frame structure, probably 3 or 4 stories tall, with each successive floor jutting out slightly over the one below it, a style called jettying that gives London's streets their distinctive top-heavy appearance. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a lattice of wooden strips covered with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung, all whitewashed to give the illusion of respectability. Through these walls you can hear everything. The family next door is already stirring. You can hear the clatter of their fire being stoked, a child crying, someone coughing with the deep rattling sound of chronic respiratory illness that is simply a fact of life when you breathe coal smoke every day. And speaking of fire, your room is cold. The main hearth is downstairs and heat rises reluctantly through the gaps in the floorboards, bringing smoke along with it. So as your breath mists in the air as you swing your legs over the side of the bed, and you understand instantly why people in this era sleep in nightcaps, and sometimes their full underclothes. This is England, after all, and while the 1600s sit within what historians call the Little Ice Age, even a normal English winter is enough to make you reconsider ever leaving your blankets. But leave them you must. because time in 17th century London is not your own. The church bells have begun their morning chorus, first one, then another, then a cacophonous symphony of bronze voices ringing out across the city from dozens of parish churches. These bells are how London tells time, and they're telling you that it's around 5 or 6 in the morning depending on the season. In summer, when dawn comes early, so does the working day. In winter, and you might get a bit more rest, but not much. The rhythm of life here is dictated by natural light, because candles are expensive and fire is both dangerous and labour-intensive. You work while you can see, and you sleep when you can't. The floor beneath your bare feet is cold and slightly gritty. It's made of wooden planks in this middling household, but if you were poorer, it might be packed earth covered with rushes or straw. Those floor coverings are changed periodically, but periodically can mean anything from once a week to once a year, depending on the household standards and finances. The rushes trap crumbs, spilled liquids, and all manner of debris, creating a kind of archaeological record of daily life that you really don't want to examine too closely. One contemporary writer described the average London floor covering as containing spittle, vomit, dog's urine, scraps of fish, and other filth unnameable, and he wasn't exaggerating. You make your way carefully through the dim room, navigating around a wooden chest that holds most of the family's worldly goods. Clothing, linens, perhaps some stored food or valuables. Furniture is sparse by modern standards. The bed, the chest, maybe a stool or two, and a small table. Everything is handmade, solid, and intended to last for generations. The concept of disposable furniture, of buying something cheap and replacing it in a few years, doesn't exist yet. When you acquire a piece of furniture, you expect your grandchildren to use it. You need to relieve yourself, and this presents your first real challenge of the day. If you're lucky, there's a chamber pot tucked under the bed, a ceramic or metal vessel that you can use for nocturnal emergencies. But that pot will need to be emptied, and the emptying will be done by dumping its contents out the window into the street below, or carrying it downstairs to the cesspit in the tiny backyard, or simply contributing to the open sewer that runs down the middle of your street. The phrase, "Gardez l'eau," which will eventually become loo, is a warning cry that Londoners learn to listen for, lest they find themselves showered with their neighbour's waste. The privy, if your house has one, is a wooden seat over a deep pit somewhere in the back of the property, and visiting it in winter or in the dark requires genuine courage. The church bells continue their ringing, and now other sounds are joining the morning chorus. And someone is already calling their wares in the street below. "Hot peas! Hot peas!" And you can hear the rumble of cartwheels on the rough cobblestones. A dog is barking somewhere, answered by another, and then another, because dogs in 1600s, London are everywhere, serving as guards, ratters, companions, and sometimes food. Life is stirring all around you, and you're expected to stir with it. You look around your cramped, smoky, smelly little room one more time, taking in the faded religious print tacked to the wall, the single clouded glass window that admits more cold air than light, the bundled shapes of other family members still reluctant to leave their warm cocoon. This is home for most Londoners, not a refuge from the world, but an extension of it, where privacy is a rumour and comfort is whatever you can carve out for yourself between the demands of work, family, and survival. Welcome to the 1600s. You're going to need all the resilience you can muster. The moment you open the front door of your timber-framed house and step into the street, you understand why so many 17th century Londoners describe their city as overwhelming. The noise hits you first, a wall of sound so dense and varied that your modern ears, accustomed to the relatively organised chaos of contemporary cities, struggle to process it all. This is London before the invention of the internal combustion engine, before recorded music, before the general background hum of electrical civilization, and somehow it is louder than anything you've ever experienced. The church bells are still ringing. Of course, they're always ringing, it seems, marking the hours, calling the faithful to prayer, announcing deaths and weddings and important civic occasions. But layered over that bronze foundation is the music of London's street traders, each one crying their wares in distinctive sing-song calls that have been honed over generations to cut through the urban din. "Ripe strawberries," calls one voice. "Any kitchen stuff have you, maids?" demands another. "Chimney sweep. Old chairs to mend. Hot codlings." The calls overlap and interweave, creating a kind of commercial symphony that plays from dawn to dusk. And then there are the animals. London in the 1600s is as much a city of beasts as of people. Horses clatter through the streets, pulling carts and carriages, their hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones. Our cattle and sheep are driven through on their way to market, adding their lowing and bleating to the general tumult, along with the inevitable consequences of large animals in confined spaces, consequences that you step around carefully as you make your way down the street. Pigs root in the garbage, dogs dart between legs, chickens flutter and squawk from backyard coops. The sound of a rooster crowing might seem charmingly rustic, but when it's answered by a dozen others within earshot, all of them apparently determined to outcrow each other starting at 4 a.m, the charm fades somewhat. Human voices add another layer, the chatter of neighbours greeting each other, the shouts of apprentices calling customers into shops, the arguments and negotiations and gossip that are the constant background music of any community. Children are yelling, playing in the streets with hoops and balls and improvised games that will get them boxed on the ears if they get in the way of adult business. Somewhere nearby, a street musician is playing a fiddle, hoping for a few coins from passers-by. Somewhere else, a preacher is holding forth on the sins of the city, competing for attention with a ballad seller hawking printed song sheets. You realise, as you navigate through this sensory assault, that 17th century London has no concept of sound pollution. The noise is simply a fact of life, as unremarkable to most residents as the air they breathe, which, speaking of air, is another matter entirely. The smell you noticed inside your house was merely a preview. Out here, the full bouquet of Stuart London unfolds before your nostrils like some horrifying aromatic flower. The dominant note is smoke. London burns coal for heat. It has for over a century, ever since the nearby forests were exhausted and the city became dependent on sea coal shipped down from Newcastle. The smoke from tens of thousands of coal fires mingles with the smoke from bakers' ovens, brewers' kilns, smiths' forges, and various industrial operations to create a permanent haze that hangs over the city like a dirty brown blanket. On bad days, this smog is thick enough to obscure the sun and coat every surface with a layer of greasy soot. Londoners cough constantly, their lungs scarred by a lifetime of breathing this poison, and the rate of respiratory disease is astronomical by modern standards. But the smoke is almost pleasant compared to what lies beneath it. The streets themselves are the primary culprits, open channels running down the centre of each road, serving as the city's main sewer system. Into these channels flows everything: human waste tossed from chamber pots, animal manure from the constant traffic of beasts, the runoff from slaughterhouses and tanneries and dye works, kitchen scraps and rotting vegetables and miscellaneous fluids of every description. The channels are supposed to drain eventually into the Thames, and they do, more or less, but the gradient is often insufficient. The volume is overwhelming, and the result is a slow-moving river of filth that bakes in the summer sun and freezes into unspeakable ice sculptures in the winter. You learn very quickly to walk close to the walls of buildings, for 2 reasons. First, the centre of the street, where the sewer channel runs, is the worst place to be for both your nose and your shoes. Second, the buildings overhead project outward with each story, creating a kind of covered walkway that offers some protection from the various substances that might be thrown from upper windows. The phrase "taking the wall," meaning walking on the inside of the sidewalk closest to the buildings, is a mark of social status. Gentlemen yield the wall to ladies, servants yield to masters, and everyone tries to avoid being pushed into the muck at the centre of the road. And yet somehow, people adapt. You watch the Londoners around you going about their business, apparently unbothered by conditions that would send a modern health inspector into cardiac arrest. A woman picks her way through the filth in wooden patterns, elevated platforms that strap over her shoes to lift her an inch or two above the worst of it. A gentleman in fine clothes is carried past in a sedan chair, avoiding the street entirely. Children play in the gutters, splashing through puddles you wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, and yet most of them survive. Their immune systems hardened by constant exposure to everything the 17th century can throw at them. The buildings press in on either side of you, their upper stories leaning so close together that neighbours on opposite sides of the street could, and sometimes do, shake hands across the gap. This architectural style, combined with the narrow medieval lanes that make up most of London's street plan, means that direct sunlight reaches street level only at midday, and sometimes not even then. The shadows are permanent, the air is still, and the sense of claustrophobia is intense. A contemporary visitor from the countryside might describe London as a kind of canyon, or perhaps a trap. And they wouldn't be entirely wrong. You pass a shop where an apprentice is taking down the wooden shutters that protected the merchandise overnight. These shutters fold down to create a kind of counter, displaying goods to passers-by, while the shopkeeper works inside. There are no glass display windows yet. Glass is still too expensive for such frivolous use, and the shop interior is dark, lit only by candles, and whatever light filters in from the open front. The apprentice eyes you hopefully, ready to launch into his sales pitch, but you move on before he can begin. Here's something that might surprise you about this noisy, smelly, chaotic street. It's also remarkably social. People stop to chat constantly, exchanging news and gossip, complaining about prices and weather and the general state of the world. The boundaries between public and private life are much thinner than they will become in later centuries. Your business is everyone's business, and everyone's business is yours. This can be suffocating. There's no anonymity in London, no way to disappear into the crowd as you might in a modern city. But it also creates a kind of community safety net. Your neighbours know if you're sick, if you're struggling, if you're doing something you shouldn't. For better or worse, you are watched. A cart loaded with barrels forces you to press yourself against a wall as it rumbles past. The driver cursing at pedestrians who don't move fast enough. The street is simply too narrow for the traffic it carries, a problem that will only worsen as London continues to grow. There's no organised traffic control, no lanes or signals, just a constant negotiation between carts and carriages and sedan chairs and pedestrians and animals, all trying to occupy the same inadequate space. Accidents are common, people are run over, goods are spilled, fights break out between drivers. The city has rules about such things, but enforcement is sporadic at best. You've been outside for perhaps 5 minutes, and already you feel exhausted by the sheer sensory intensity of it all. But this is just the beginning. You haven't eaten yet. And your stomach is beginning to remind you that the medieval metabolism runs on different fuel than you're used to. Time to find some breakfast, if you can call it that. Your stomach rumbles again, more insistently this time, and you realise that the concept of breakfast in 17th century London is going to require some significant expectation adjustment. If you were imagining a full English fry-up, eggs, bacon, sausages, beans, toast, a nice cup of tea, you're about 400 years too early. Tea hasn't arrived yet, or rather it's just beginning to trickle in as an expensive curiosity that only the wealthy can afford. Coffee exists technically, but the first coffeehouse in London won't open until 1652, and even then it will take decades before the habit spreads beyond merchants and intellectuals. As for that elaborate cooked breakfast, it's a Victorian invention still centuries in the future. No, your morning meal is going to be something considerably simpler and considerably wetter. You duck into a cook shop on the corner, a modest establishment with a fire burning in the back and a counter displaying the morning's offerings. The smell of baking bread mingles with the street odours filtering in through the open front, and for a moment the combination is almost pleasant. The proprietor, a stout woman with flour-dusted arms and a no-nonsense expression, looks you up and down and waits for your order. The centrepiece of your breakfast will be ale, not as a beverage choice, not as an indulgence, but as a basic survival necessity. The water in London is quite simply not safe to drink. The city draws its water from the Thames, from various wells and springs, and from an elaborate system of pipes and conduits that would be impressive if they weren't thoroughly contaminated with sewage, industrial runoff, and various substances you'd rather not contemplate. The wealthy can afford to have water brought in from cleaner sources outside the city, but for everyone else the brewing process, which involves boiling the water and adding antibacterial hops, renders ale the safest liquid available. So you drink ale. Everyone drinks ale. Children drink ale, a weak, watery version called small beer that contains barely any alcohol but has been sufficiently processed to kill most of the things that would otherwise kill them. Adults drink stronger stuff, starting with that small beer at breakfast and progressing to more potent brews as the day goes on. The average Londoner consumes something like a gallon of ale per day, a quantity that sounds absurd until you realise that much of it is quite weak, and that there's simply no alternative. Historians still argue whether this constant low-level alcohol consumption affected productivity and behaviour, but given that the entire economy functioned and people somehow managed to build ships and write plays and run businesses, the effects couldn't have been too debilitating. Along with your ale, you receive a chunk of bread. Coarse, dark bread made from wheat mixed with rye or barley. Nothing like the fluffy white loaves you're used to. White bread exists, but it's a luxury for the wealthy. The poor and middling sort eat bread that would probably be marketed as artisanal and sold for $8 a loaf in a modern hipster bakery. It's dense, chewy, and surprisingly filling, and you tear off pieces to dip in your ale, softening the crust enough to make it edible without risking your teeth. If you have a few extra pennies to spend, you might add some cheese to this meal, hard, salty cheese that keeps well without refrigeration, or perhaps a bit of cold meat left over from yesterday's dinner. Fresh meat in the morning is reserved for those who can afford servants to prepare it, but a slice of cold bacon or a piece of salted fish can add some variety to the bread and ale routine. Some people break their fast on nothing but a bowl of pottage. A thick stew or porridge made from whatever vegetables, grains and scraps happen to be available, kept simmering on the fire for days at a time and added to continuously. Pottage is the original perpetual stew, and the idea of it either sounds cosy and sustainable or deeply concerning depending on your perspective. What you definitely won't find at breakfast is any sense of hurry. The meal is quick by necessity. Work awaits and daylight is burning, but no one is eating standing up, no one is grabbing food to consume on the go. The idea of a portable breakfast, of eating while walking or riding, would strike most 17th century people as bizarre and vaguely barbaric. You eat at a table, or at least standing at a counter, and you eat with a certain amount of attention to the act itself. Food is not yet so abundant that it can be treated casually. Here's a quirky detail that might amuse you. The concept of 3 meals a day is still relatively new and somewhat controversial. For most of the medieval period, people ate 2 main meals, a large dinner around midday and a lighter supper in the evening, with perhaps some bread and ale on waking if they were lucky. The idea of a formal breakfast is a 16th and 17th century innovation, spreading slowly through society as work patterns change and as the middle class grows wealthy enough to afford the extra food. Some moralists still grumble about the practice, viewing it as a sign of decadence and self-indulgence. If you need to eat first thing in the morning, the thinking goes, perhaps you didn't eat enough the night before, or perhaps you're simply weak. The food itself is heavily influenced by ideas about health that would strike a modern person as charmingly misguided. The prevailing medical theory holds that the body is governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, cestine, black bile, and that health depends on keeping these humours in proper balance. Each food has its own humoral qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry, and eating properly means choosing foods that will correct any imbalances in your particular constitution. If you're naturally choleric, too much yellow bile, you should avoid hot, dry foods that will inflame your temperament. If you're phlegmatic, too much, phlegm, you need warming foods to dry you out. This sounds absurd, but in practice it leads to some surprisingly sensible dietary advice. Eating a variety of foods, paying attention to how different foods make you feel, adjusting your diet with the seasons, these are all humoral principles that a modern nutritionist might not entirely disagree with, even if the underlying theory is nonsense. The real problems come when people start applying humoral theory to specific medical conditions, but that's a story for later when we visit the barber surgeon. You finish your modest breakfast and drop a few coins on the counter. Food is cheap in London, relative to wages, which is one of the reasons the city keeps attracting migrants from the countryside. A labourer might earn 6pence a day, and that's enough to keep body and soul together, barely. The cookshop woman nods her thanks and turns to serve the next customer, and you step back out into the street, ale warmed and ready to face whatever the day brings. But first, you're going to need to get dressed properly. You've been wearing your night things this whole time, covered by a loose gown against the morning chill, and that's perfectly acceptable for a quick breakfast run. But the day's real business requires a real outfit, and putting one together is going to be considerably more complicated than reaching for jeans and a t-shirt. You return to your lodgings to get properly dressed, and as you contemplate the pile of garments waiting for you, you begin to understand why wealthy people employed servants specifically for the task of helping them put on clothes. This is not a simple operation. This is an engineering project involving multiple layers, numerous fastenings, and a fundamental philosophy of dress that has almost nothing in common with modern clothing. Let's start with the basics: underwear. The foundation of any 17th century outfit is the linen layer, and this layer does most of the actual work of keeping you clean and comfortable. You put on a shirt, if you're male, or a shift, if you're female, a loose long garment made of linen that serves as a barrier between your body and your outer clothes. This shirt or shift is the only garment that will be washed with any regularity, which is why it needs to be visible at the collar and cuffs of your outer clothing. Those white bits peeking out are not decoration. They're proof that you're wearing clean linen underneath, and thus proof that you're a respectable person who maintains basic standards of hygiene. Over the shirt come your stockings, which are not the stretchy nylon tubes you're familiar with, but knitted or woven leg coverings that reach to the thigh and are held up by garters tied below the knee. If you're a man of any social standing, these stockings matter quite a lot. They're visible below your knee-length breeches, and their quality and colour say something about your wealth and taste. Silk stockings are the pinnacle of fashion for those who can afford them. Everyone else makes do with wool or cotton. Now comes the tricky part. If you're male, you're putting on breeches. Loose, baggy trousers that reach just below the knee, fastened at the waist with hooks or buttons, and at the knee with more buttons or ribbons. Over your shirt goes a waistcoat or doublet, a close-fitting garment that buttons up the front and provides an additional layer of warmth. And over that goes your coat or jerkin, which is where things get really complicated, because the style of your outer garment announces your social position more loudly than almost anything else about you. You see, in 17th century England, clothing is regulated by law. The sumptuary laws technically dictate what each class of person is permitted to wear, restricting certain fabrics, colours and styles to certain ranks. In practice, these laws are increasingly honoured in the breach. The rising middle class has money and wants to look good, and enforcement is sporadic at best. But the principle behind the laws reflects a deep truth about this society. What you wear is not a matter of personal expression but of social communication. Your clothes tell everyone who you are, what you do, and where you stand in the great hierarchy of English society. If you're a labourer, your clothes are simple and practical. Wool and linen in undyed or drab colours, sturdy enough to survive hard work, loose enough to allow movement. If you're a merchant or tradesman, you can afford better fabrics and brighter colours, but you're still expected to dress with a certain sober respectability that reflects your position. If you're gentry or nobility, well, then the sky is the limit. Silks and velvets, elaborate embroidery, enormous lace collars that must be starched and set every time you wear them. The wealthy spend truly astonishing amounts on their wardrobes, and their clothes are among their most valuable possessions, frequently mentioned in wills and passed down through generations. For women, the process is even more elaborate. The shift comes first, then possibly a pair of bodies, what will eventually evolve into the corset, a stiffened garment that shapes the torso according to the fashionable silhouette of the moment. In the 1600s, this means flattening the bust and creating a smooth, conical shape from shoulder to waist. The bodies can be made of layers of stiffened fabric, or, for the wealthy, reinforced with whalebone or even metal strips. They're uncomfortable by modern standards, but not necessarily the torture devices that Victorian corsets will become. Most women are accustomed to them from girlhood, and find them supportive rather than restrictive. Over the bodies goes the petticoat, or rather petticoats plural, because a well-dressed woman might wear several layers depending on the weather and the occasion. The outermost layer is the gown, which can be constructed in various ways depending on fashion and budget. Some gowns are one piece, others separate into a bodice and skirt that lace or pin together. Sleeves might be attached or separate, allowing them to be changed for variety without replacing the entire garment. The whole ensemble is finished with a coif or cap covering the hair, which all married women wear, and various accessories depending on status, an apron for practical work, a cloak for warmth, perhaps a fan or a mask for those going into society. Here's something that might strike you about all this clothing. Most of it cannot be put on or taken off by oneself. The fastenings are in inconvenient places, the layers require adjustment, and the whole system seems designed on the assumption that you'll have help. For the wealthy, this is no problem. Servants are there precisely for this purpose. For everyone else, dressing is a cooperative activity. Husbands help wives, children help parents, apprentices help masters. The lone individual struggling into their clothes is actually something of an anomaly. The colours available to you depend largely on your budget. The cheapest dyes, browns, dull reds, russets and dark blues, are within reach of ordinary people. Brighter colours like crimson and violet require more expensive dyes, often imported, and are thus markers of wealth. Black is surprisingly expensive because achieving a true rich black that doesn't fade to muddy grey is technically challenging. The Puritans who favour black clothing are actually making something of a status statement, whether they realise it or not. As you wrestle with your various fastenings, and 17th century clothing has more hooks, points, laces, buttons, de sersoyer, sact, and ties than seem strictly necessary, you reflect on how different this relationship with clothing is from your own era. These garments represent significant investments of money and labour. The fabric was woven by hand, the garments sewn by hand, every button and ribbon made by individual craftspeople. You don't replace clothing because you're tired of it. You wear it until it can't be mended anymore, then recycle the fabric into something else. Second-hand clothing is a major market, and wearing used clothes carries no particular stigma. Historians still argue whether people in this era valued their clothing more than we do, or simply had no choice, but the effect is the same. Every garment matters. Finally, after what feels like an unreasonable amount of effort, you're dressed. You check yourself in the small, slightly warped mirror that's the best your household can afford. Mirrors are made by coating glass with a lead-tin amalgam, and they never quite achieve the perfect reflection you're used to. But you can see enough to confirm that you look more or less respectable, and that's what counts. Now, properly armoured against the day, you can venture out to navigate the city's next challenge, the streets themselves, and the truly astonishing amount of human waste they contain. You step back out into the London morning, properly dressed this time, and ready to go about your business. But before you can get very far, you need to make a decision that every Londoner faces multiple times a day. How to navigate the open sewer that runs down the middle of the street without ruining your clothes, your shoes, or your sanity. The street before you is perhaps 12 feet wide, which sounds reasonable until you realise that a good 4 feet of that width is occupied by the channel running down the centre, the kennel, as it's called, though the word sounds far too cute for what it actually is. This channel is where everything goes. Household waste, animal waste, industrial waste, runoff from rain and snowmelt, the occasional dead cat or rat, and substances whose origins you'd rather not contemplate, all flowing sluggishly towards some distant drainage point that may or may not actually exist. The smell is, of course, indescribable. Actually, no, it's entirely describable, but the description would turn your stomach, so let's simply acknowledge that this is the reality you're walking through and move on. What's remarkable is how quickly the human nose adapts. After a few minutes, you stop noticing the smell as actively unpleasant. It becomes simply the background odour of existence, no more noteworthy than the air itself. This is how Londoners survive psychologically, not by having better noses, but by having noses that learn to filter out the constant assault. The channel is supposed to be cleaned periodically by scavengers and rakers, city employees whose job is to remove the accumulated filth and cart it away to designated dump sites outside the city walls. In theory, this happens regularly. In practice, enforcement is inconsistent, budgets are limited, and the volume of waste produced by 500,000 people and their animals simply overwhelms any pre-modern sanitation system. Some streets are better maintained than others. The wealthier neighbourhoods can afford to hire private cleaners, or to bribe the city officials into prioritising their areas, but even the best-kept streets would strike a modern observer as shockingly foul. You pick your way along the edge of the street, hugging the building fronts where the ground is slightly elevated, and the worst of the muck doesn't quite reach. The wooden pattens you've strapped over your shoes help somewhat, raising you an inch or two above the ground, but they also make walking awkward. You have to concentrate to keep your footing, and the constant clacking of wood on stone makes stealth impossible. Still, better to sound like a tap dancer than to squelch through the street's contents directly. The residents of each house are theoretically responsible for keeping the portion of the street in front of their property clean, and some actually do make an effort. You pass one house where an apprentice is dutifully sweeping the area before the shop front, pushing refuse toward the central channel with a determined expression. You pass another where the street is practically pristine, clearly the home of someone with standards or money or both, and then you pass a third where the situation defies description, a miniature lake of horror that you skirt with exaggerated care, wondering how anyone could live with such a mess on their doorstep. Here's a detail that historians love to debate. Did Londoners actually throw the contents of chamber pots out of windows? The evidence suggests yes, sometimes, as despite regulations against the practice. The cry of "Garde l'eau," watch out for water, was supposedly a warning, though how much warning you could actually get in the narrow, crowded streets is questionable. Various civic ordinances attempted to regulate such behaviour, with mixed success. The practice was more common at night, when the streets were empty, but daytime incidents certainly occurred. If you hear someone shouting from an upper window, the wise Londoner learns to look up and step aside. The paving under your feet, where it exists, consists of rough cobblestones or sometimes flat stones, set unevenly and prone to working loose over time. Some streets are paved, others are simply packed earth that becomes mud in wet weather and dust in dry. The city's growth has outpaced its infrastructure. Newly developed areas often have no paving at all. Walking in the 17th century London is genuinely hazardous. Twisted ankles are common, and falls into the central channel are an ever-present risk. The elderly, the drunk and the unwary are all vulnerable. And yet, despite all this, life goes on. You watch a woman carry a basket of vegetables through the street, navigating the obstacles with the practiced ease of someone who's done this thousands of times. A child runs past, somehow finding solid footing that you would never have spotted. A pair of gentlemen in fine clothes manage to cross from one side to the other without visibly soiling their outfits. A small miracle of urban navigation. The city is filthy, but it's navigably filthy, and its residents have developed skills and strategies that you're only beginning to learn. The public health consequences of all this are exactly what you'd expect. Waterborne diseases like typhoid and cholera flourish in this environment. Though people in the 17th century don't understand why, the germ theory of disease is still 200 years away. Instead, they blame miasma, bad air that rises from rotting matter and somehow causes illness. This theory is wrong, but it leads to some useful practices. Efforts to improve drainage and remove waste do help, even if the reasoning behind them is misguided. The one genuinely life-saving technology of the era, the boiling of water to make ale and small beer, works for reasons no one understands. As you make your way through the streets, stepping over obstacles and around hazards, you begin to see the logic of certain choices that might otherwise seem strange. Why do wealthy people travel by sedan, chair or coach, rather than walking like everyone else? Because walking through this is genuinely awful, and anyone who can afford to be carried will choose that option. Why do houses turn inward, focusing on their interior courtyards and gardens rather than on the street frontage? Because the street is no place to linger. Why do people drink so much ale? Because the water will kill you. You're heading toward London Bridge now, the only fixed crossing over the Thames, and the street you're on is getting more crowded as various tributary routes funnel traffic toward that single choke point. The press of bodies is almost welcome. At least other people's feet are disturbing the muck rather than yours, and there's a certain safety in numbers. Pickpockets work these crowds, but so do the watch and the constables, and blatant crime is risky when so many eyes are watching. The bridge is visible now, rising above the surrounding buildings, and you quicken your pace despite the treacherous footing. London Bridge is more than just a crossing. It's a destination, a street, a neighbourhood, and a gruesome public gallery all rolled into one. And those heads on spikes. You're about to get a much closer look than you'd really like. London Bridge rises before you, and for a moment you have to stop and simply take it in. This is not a bridge as you understand the term, a clean span of concrete or steel allowing traffic to flow from one bank to the other. This is a bridge that someone has inexplicably decided to cover with buildings, transforming a river crossing into something that resembles a crowded street suspended over water. There are shops here, and houses, and even a chapel, all built directly onto the bridge's stone piers, their upper stories jutting out over the Thames in a manner that seems to defy both gravity and common sense. The bridge is about 900 feet long and roughly 20 feet wide, though the buildings on either side effectively narrow the passage to something closer to 12 feet in places. Through this constricted space flows all the traffic between London proper, on the north bank, and Southwark on the south. Carts, coaches, horses, cattle, sheep, and thousands of pedestrians every day, all competing for room in a space that was never designed for this volume of use. The congestion is legendary. You can spend an hour trying to cross on a busy market day, shuffling forward inches at a time while vendors hawk their wares from the shop fronts, and children dart between legs. But before you enter this chaos, you need to look up. Specifically, you need to look at the gatehouse at the southern end of the bridge, where the bridge meets Southwark, because there, mounted on iron spikes above the archway, are the heads. This is the practice of displaying executed traitors' heads as a warning to others, and London Bridge has been the traditional showcase for this grim gallery for centuries. The heads are parboiled and dipped in tar to preserve them, then mounted on poles where they remain until they rot away or a new head displaces them. At various points in the 17th century there might be a dozen or more heads on display, their eyeless faces gazing down at everyone who crosses the bridge. You stare up at them, these remnants of men who were once alive, who had families and histories, and perhaps genuinely believed they were doing the right thing when they committed whatever act of treason brought them here. The crowd around you barely glances at them. They're part of the scenery, as unremarkable as the shops or the water below. Children have grown up seeing these heads. They know no different. This is what happens to those who threaten the crown, and the display is meant to be instructive. The practice seems barbaric to you, and you're not wrong to feel that way. But here's something to consider. Public punishment, including capital punishment, serves a different function in this society than it does in yours. There are no prisons for long-term incarceration. Jails exist only to hold people awaiting trial or punishment, not as punishment itself. The options available to the legal system are fines, corporal punishment, exile, or death. And since the state lacks the resources to maintain a surveillance system or a large police force, deterrence depends heavily on the visible, visceral horror of public execution. Historians still argue whether such displays actually deterred crime or treasoned. The evidence is mixed, and people continued to commit treasonable acts despite the gruesome consequences that awaited them. But the psychological impact on the community was real. Everyone knew what the stakes were. Everyone understood viscerally what power could do to those who defied it. You tear your eyes away from the heads and enter the bridge proper. The noise changes immediately. The sounds of the street are now mixed with the rushing of the river below, which forces its way through the bridge's narrow arches with considerable violence. The watermills built into several of the piers add their grinding roar to the cacophony. And everywhere, the cries of shopkeepers compete with the rumble of traffic, and the protests of animals being driven across. The shops on London Bridge are among the finest in the city, or at least the most expensive. Real estate here is precious, and the rents reflect it. You pass haberdashers and glovers and sellers of silk and lace, their wares displayed in open-fronted shops that allow passers-by to browse while keeping one eye on the slow-moving crowd. The shopkeepers' apprentices call out to potential customers, promising the best prices, the finest quality, goods direct from the continent. It's like walking through an aggressive open-air mall, except the mall is swaying slightly because you're on a bridge, and the background music is provided by screaming seagulls rather than soft rock. The houses built on the bridge are actually rather desirable residences, despite the obvious inconveniences. They catch river breezes that can be refreshing in summer, and the views from the upper stories are spectacular. Of course, those same river breezes carry the smell of the Thames, which is essentially an open sewer, but in a city where nothing smells particularly good, the bridge might actually represent an improvement over some neighbourhoods. The residents tend to be successful tradespeople, wealthy enough to afford the rents but not wealthy enough to own townhouses elsewhere. You're about halfway across now, and you pause to look over the side, or rather, you try to look over the side, but the buildings block any view of the water. There are a few gaps between buildings where you can catch a glimpse of the river below, and what you see is remarkable. The Thames is packed with boats, wherries carrying passengers, barges hauling goods, small craft of every description crisscrossing the water in a constant chaotic flow. The river is London's main highway, far more efficient than the clogged streets for moving people and goods, and the stretch of water immediately downstream of the bridge is particularly dangerous, because the narrow arches create a kind of rapids that less experienced boatmen sometimes fail to navigate. Shooting the bridge, as it's called, requires skill and nerve. The water piles up on the upstream side, then rushes through the arches with tremendous force, dropping several feet in a churning cascade before calming again on the downstream side. Passengers who need to cross this stretch often disembark before the bridge, walk across and rejoin their boat on the other side, not from excess of caution, but because the boatmen themselves sometimes refuse to attempt the passage with passengers aboard. Deaths are common enough that shooting the bridge has become a kind of dare among young men, and the phrase itself has entered the language as a metaphor for risky undertakings. You continue across, finally emerging on the Suffolk side, passing under the gatehouse and its grim display. The atmosphere changes immediately. You've left the city proper. Technically, Southwark is outside London's jurisdiction, governed by different laws and harbouring businesses that the city authorities would rather not have within their walls. This is where you'll find the brothels and the bear-baiting arenas and the theatres, all the entertainments that respectable Londoners officially disapprove of and unofficially patronise with enthusiasm. But entertainment is for later. Right now, you need to understand how ordinary Londoners earn their living, because work in the 17th century is nothing like what you're used to. The guilds are waiting to explain in excruciating detail exactly what you're allowed to do and how you're allowed to do it. The sun is properly up now, such as it is, a pale disk barely visible through London's perpetual haze of coal smoke, and the working day is well underway. All around you. People are earning their livings in ways that would seem both familiar and utterly alien to a modern observer. The baker is baking, the tailor is tailoring, the blacksmith is smithing. But the rules governing how they do these things, and who gets to do them at all, would make a modern labour lawyer's head spin. Welcome to the world of the guilds, the livery companies, the ancient and honourable associations of craftsmen and traders that control almost every aspect of economic life in the city. If you want to understand how work actually functions in 17th century London, you need to understand these organisations, because they're not just trade associations or social clubs. They're the fundamental structure around which the entire urban economy is built. Here's how it works. Almost every legitimate trade in London is organised into a guild or company. There are the great livery companies, the mercers, the grocers, the drapers, the fishmongers, the goldsmiths, and so on, which rank among the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in the city. And there are the lesser companies, dozens of them, representing everyone from the cordwainers, shoemakers, to the tallow chandlers, candlemakers, to the rather wonderfully named Worshipful Company of Horners, who work with horn, making cups and buttons and knife handles. If you want to practice a trade in London, you must belong to the appropriate guild. You cannot simply decide to become a baker and open a bakery. You must be admitted to the Bakers' Company, which means you must first serve a long apprenticeship under a master baker. Then work as a journeyman while you save money and perfect your skills, and finally petition the company for admission as a full master. The whole process takes years. 7 years of apprenticeship is standard, though some trades require more, and there's no guarantee of success at the end. The guilds control entry jealously, limiting competition to protect existing members. This might sound restrictive, and it is. But the guild system also provides structure and security in ways that the modern gig economy notably lacks. As an apprentice, you're not just an employee, you're practically a member of your master's family. You live in his house, eat at his table, wear clothes he provides. He's responsible for your moral education and general welfare as well as your professional training. If he mistreats you, you can appeal to the guild, which has mechanisms for addressing such complaints. If he dies before your apprenticeship ends, the guild will find you another master. It's paternalistic and controlling, but it's also a system that genuinely tries to protect young workers. The guild also maintains quality standards. When you buy bread from a baker who belongs to the Bakers' Company, you can be reasonably confident that it's been made according to certain specifications, the right weight, the right ingredients, sold at a fair price. Guild wardens inspect their members' work regularly, checking for fraud or shoddy workmanship. Violators can be fined, publicly shamed, or expelled from the guild entirely, which effectively ends their career. This sounds like consumer protection, and to some extent it is. Though the guilds are at least as interested in protecting their own reputations and limiting competition as they are in serving the public. You watch a young apprentice sweeping out a shop while his master prepares to open for business. The boy is perhaps 12 or 13 years old. Apprenticeships typically begin around that age, though they can start younger, and he'll spend the next 7 years learning his trade, doing the drudge work, being trained and disciplined, and gradually initiated into the mysteries of his profession. It's a hard life in many ways, long hours, strict rules, limited freedom, but at the end of it, he'll have a marketable skill and a place in the economic structure of the city. That's more than many can say. Here's something that might surprise you about the guild system. It's actually quite possible for women to participate, at least in some trades. Widows of guild members often continue their husbands' businesses, exercising full rights within the company. Some guilds admit women members in their own right. Women work as brewers, as butchers, as weavers. as practitioners of numerous trades that later centuries will declare unsuitable for the feminine constitution. The 17th century is hardly a paradise of gender equality. We'll talk more about women's lives later. But the rigid segregation of work by gender is not yet complete. Historians still argue about whether the guild system helped or hindered London's economic development. On one hand, it restricted competition and prevented innovation, protecting established interests at the expense of newcomers with new ideas. On the other hand, it provided quality assurance, worker protection, and social stability in an era without government regulation or social safety nets. The truth is probably that the system served different interests at different times, and its effects varied widely depending on which guild and which period you examine. What you notice, watching the city go about its business, is how visible work is in this world. There are no anonymous office buildings where labour happens behind closed doors. The baker's shop is open to the street, so you can watch the bread being made. The blacksmith's forge is similarly exposed, ringing with the sound of hammer on anvil. The tailor sits in his shop window, stitching in full view of passers-by. Work is public, communal, embedded in the fabric of daily life in a way that modern labour, hidden away in offices and factories, simply is not. This visibility serves multiple purposes. It's advertising, obviously. The craftsman's skill on display attracts customers. It's also supervision. The community can see if standards are being maintained. And it's social in the deeper sense. Work is not something you leave home to do, but something that happens at home, with your family and apprentices around you, integrated into the rhythm of domestic life. You've spent the morning observing London's economy, and your feet are tired. The city stretches on around you, busy and purposeful, everyone engaged in the ancient human activity of making a living. But there's still much to see, and the river is calling. Time to discover how Londoners actually get around this sprawling, congested medieval mess of a city, and why a simple boat ride can be one of the most dangerous things you'll do all day. You've walked enough for one morning. Your feet ache, your pattens have rubbed blisters, and the streets seem to be getting more crowded and more fragrant with every passing hour. It's time to do what sensible Londoners have done for centuries: take to the water. The Thames is London's greatest asset, and its main highway, flowing through the heart of the city, roughly a quarter-mile wide in this era, it carries more traffic than all the streets combined. While carriages and carts battle for space in the narrow lanes, while pedestrians pick their way through the muck, the river offers a relatively smooth and efficient passage from one part of the city to another. And getting on the river is remarkably easy. You simply walk down to any of the dozens of stairs or landing points along the banks and hire a boat. You approach a set of river stairs, a simple stone structure leading down from the street to the water's edge. Half a dozen wherries are waiting there, their oarsmen calling out for passengers. "Oars! Oars!" they cry, the traditional call that identifies them as licensed watermen ready for hire. "Westward ho!" shouts one, advertising his destination. "Eastward, eastward," responds another. It's a water-based taxi system, and it works with surprising efficiency. You negotiate a fare. Prices are regulated by the Watermen's Company, another guild, though bargaining is always possible, and step carefully into a wherry. These boats are typically about 20 feet long and perhaps 5 feet wide, and rowed by 1 or 2 watermen depending on the distance and the current. They're stable enough, designed for exactly this purpose, but stepping into one from a slippery stone stair requires a certain faith that the waterman will hold it steady. He does, extending a hand to help you aboard, and you settle onto the wooden seat as he pushes off. The sensation is immediate relief. The air on the river, while still far from fresh, is notably better than the miasma of the streets. The sounds of the city recede slightly, replaced by the creak of oars and the gentle splash of water. Other boats move around you in a complex dance, wherries carrying passengers, barges hauling coal and grain and timber, small fishing boats, grand state barges rowed by dozens of oarsmen. The river is alive with activity, a liquid main street that never quite sleeps. But do not be deceived by this relative tranquility. The Thames is dangerous. The water itself is essentially an open sewer, receiving the outputs of all those channels and kennels you've been stepping around, plus the direct discharges of the tanneries and slaughterhouses and dye works that cluster along its banks. Falling in is not just unpleasant, it's genuinely hazardous to your health. The watermen know this, which is why the first thing any passenger learns is to sit still and keep their hands inside the boat. More immediately dangerous is the traffic. With no traffic lights, no lane markings, no Coast Guard or harbour patrol, the river operates on a system of custom and shouted communication. Right of way is negotiated in real time with much cursing and occasional collisions. The watermen are skilled. They've apprenticed to their trade like any other craftsman. But accidents happen, boats capsize, passengers drown. Swimming is not a common skill in this era, and the waters are treacherous even for those who can swim. And then there's the bridge. Remember London Bridge, which you crossed earlier? From the water it looks even more imposing. A massive stone barrier across the river, with narrow arches through which the Thames must force itself. Above the bridge, the water is relatively calm. Below, it's faster and deeper. The transition between these two states happens in the span of those arches, and it's violent enough to kill. Your waterman is taking you downstream, which means he needs to shoot the bridge if you're going much further. You feel the current pick up as you approach. You'll see the water piling against the upstream side of the bridge, churning and swirling around the massive stone piers. The waterman positions his boat carefully, choosing his arch, timing his approach. And then you're through. A moment of rushing water and lurching movement, the bridge passing overhead, and suddenly you're on the other side, the current gentler, your heart rate gradually returning to normal. Some passengers, as you recall, choose to walk across the bridge rather than shoot it. You're beginning to understand why. Here's a quirky detail about travel on the Thames. Swans. The river is home to a large population of swans, and these birds are not just wildlife, they're royal property, protected by law, and interfering with them is a serious offence. The tradition of royal swan ownership goes back centuries, and even in the 1600s. An annual swan-upping ceremony counts and marks the swans on the Thames. Hitting a swan with your wherry, or worse, being suspected of stealing one, can land you in considerable trouble. The birds themselves are notably ill-tempered and unimpressed by human concerns, paddling serenely through the traffic as if they own the place, which, in a sense, they do. The watermen who row these boats are a distinctive London tribe. They have their own guild, their own customs, their own famously colourful vocabulary. They're known for their sharp tongues and quick insults, shouted at each other and at passengers who try to underpay. The phrase, Thames waterman, becomes a byword for coarse wit, and some of their verbal battles are legendary. But they're also skilled workers performing a difficult and dangerous job. They're moving tens of thousands of passengers every day in boats they often own themselves. You pass the Bankside theatres on your right, the Globe, the Rose, the Swan, their flags flying to indicate performances today. You pass warehouses and wharves, cranes loading and unloading the ships that bring goods from all over the world. You pass the Tower of London, grim and fortress-like, a reminder of royal power and the fate of those who cross it. The city unfolds along the riverbanks, revealing aspects invisible from the streets, the grand houses of nobles with their private river stairs, the industrial zones where tanneries turn the water brown, the stairs and wharves where passengers embark and disembark in a constant human flow. Your waterman pulls expertly to a set of stairs, and you pay him his fare plus a small tip. Tipping is expected, and then, as now, and climb back up to street level. You're hungry again, and it's approaching the time when Londoners take their main meal of the day. Time to find an ordinary, and discover what counts as lunch in the 17th century. The midday bells are ringing from a dozen parish churches, overlapping and echoing across the city, and your stomach is demanding attention. It's time for dinner. Not supper, not lunch, but dinner, the main meal of the day, taken in the early afternoon while there's still plenty of daylight for the work that follows. And you're going to eat it at an ordinary, which is the 17th century equivalent of a fixed-price restaurant. The ordinary you enter is a modest establishment, neither grand nor squalid, catering to the middling sort, tradesmen, merchants, clerks, and visitors like yourself who need a decent meal at a predictable price. The room is low-ceilinged and dim, lit by a few small windows and some tallow candles that add their own distinctive smell to the general atmosphere. Wooden tables run along the walls with benches for seating, and a fire burns at one end, over which various pots and spits are doing interesting things to various foods. The concept of an ordinary is simple. At a set time, a set meal is served at a set price. You sit down with whoever else happens to be there, you eat what's provided, and you pay the going rate. It's essentially communal dining, and the social aspect is at least as important as the nutritional one. The ordinary is where you catch up on news and gossip, where deals are discussed and arguments settled, where the community gathers to eat together in a ritual as old as civilization. Today's dinner begins with pottage, that perpetual stew we mentioned earlier, thick and hearty, made from whatever vegetables are in season plus some scraps of meat for flavouring. It's not glamorous, but it's filling and nutritious, and you eat it gratefully with a chunk of bread to soak up the liquid. The bread here is better than what you had for breakfast, slightly whiter and finer, the mark of an establishment that caters to people with a few coins to spare. The main course is meat, a roast of some kind carved at the table and served with more bread and perhaps some boiled vegetables. Meat is the centrepiece of any respectable dinner, and its quality and abundance reflect the status of both the establishment and the diners. The wealthy eat meat at every meal, the poor are lucky to see it once a week. At an ordinary like this one, the meat is decent but not extravagant. A joint of beef or mutton cooked thoroughly in the English style, served without the elaborate sauces that French cuisine is beginning to make fashionable. You eat with your fingers mostly, though a knife is provided for cutting, and a spoon for the pottage. Forks exist but are still considered somewhat foreign and affected. They're catching on among the fashionable set but haven't yet penetrated to ordinary ordinaries. The technique is to cut your meat with the knife, then pick up the pieces with your fingers, using the bread to push food around and soak up juices. It sounds primitive, but there's actually an elaborate etiquette governing how to eat politely with your hands, and violating it marks you as a bore. Here's something that might surprise you about this meal. The food is actually pretty good. We tend to think of historical cuisine as bland and monotonous, but 17th century cooking uses a wide variety of spices: pepper, ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg, mace, that would have been luxuries a few centuries earlier, but are now accessible to anyone with money to spend. The cook knows her business, and the combination of flavours is complex and satisfying. You find yourself eating more enthusiastically than you expected. The drink, of course, is ale. The ordinary has its own brewing, as many establishments do, and the ale is fresh and reasonably good. Wine is available for those willing to pay extra, imported from France or Spain, expensive but increasingly popular among the middle classes. But for everyday dining, ale remains the standard. You drink more than you would in your own time, partly because the alcohol content is lower than you might expect, and partly because there's simply no alternative. The conversation around the table is lively. Politics, religion, business, scandal, all a fair game, though there are limits to what can be safely said. This is, after all, a public space where anyone might be listening, and speaking too freely against the king or the church can have serious consequences. Still, within those limits, opinion flows freely, and you learn more about what's happening in the city from an hour's dinner conversation than you could from any official source. You notice something about the way people eat together here. They share. Dishes are placed at the centre of the table and everyone serves themselves and each other. Offering the best pieces of meat to your neighbour is a mark of courtesy. Hoarding the good stuff for yourself is unforgivably rude. The individualism that characterises modern dining, everyone orders their own dish, eats their own portion, pays their own bill, doesn't exist yet. Eating is a communal act, and sharing food is how you demonstrate that you're part of the community. The meal concludes with cheese and perhaps some fruit if the season provides it. Dessert in the modern sense, elaborate sweets served after the main course, is a luxury for the wealthy. Those sweet dishes do appear at grander meals. For an ordinary dinner, a piece of cheese and an apple represent the ending of a satisfying meal. Historians still argue about the quality of the 17th century English diet. Compared to later centuries, when industrialisation and urbanisation will lead to genuine food crises, the 1600s are actually something of a golden age for ordinary people's nutrition. Food is relatively abundant and relatively affordable, and while the poor certainly suffer, the middling sort eat reasonably well. The great dietary sins of this era are not shortage, but monotony. The same foods prepared the same ways, day after day, season after season. You pay your shilling for the meal and step back into the street, satisfied and perhaps slightly drowsy from the ale. The afternoon stretches before you, and there's still much to see. But your teeth have been bothering you since this morning. That chunk of hard bread at breakfast didn't do them any favours, and you're beginning to think you might need to visit a professional. The barber surgeon's shop is just down the street, and it's time to learn exactly how medical care works in an age that predates germ theory anesthesia, and basic hygiene. The sign hanging above the shop shows a red and white striped pole, a symbol that will remain associated with barbering for centuries to come. But in the 17th century, this sign advertises more than just haircuts. The red represents blood, the white represents bandages, and the barber surgeon within is prepared to address a remarkably wide range of bodily complaints. He is from overgrown beards to rotten teeth, to the imbalanced humours that 17th century medicine believes cause most disease. You push open the door and enter a space that serves as barbershop, dental office, minor surgery clinic, and general healthcare establishment all in one. A man is sitting in a chair, his face covered with lather, while the barber scrapes a straight razor across his cheek. Another customer waits on a bench, reading one of the ballad sheets that have been left for entertainment. The room smells of soap and something metallic. Blood, you realise, noticing the basin in the corner and the stained rags beside it. The barber surgeon finishes his shave and turns to greet you. What seems to be the trouble? You explain about your tooth. It's been aching for days and the pain is getting worse. He nods sympathetically and gestures to the chair. Tooth extraction is one of his most common procedures, and he has the tools and experience to handle it. Whether he has the gentleness and precision you'd prefer is another question entirely. Here's what you need to understand about medical practice in the 17th century. It's divided into 3 overlapping professions, and the barber surgeon occupies the lowest rung of the medical hierarchy. At the top are the physicians, university-educated gentlemen who diagnose diseases and prescribe treatments, but consider it beneath their dignity to actually touch patients. They deal in theory, humoral analysis, learned consultation. In the middle are the apothecaries, who prepare and sell medicines, increasingly encroaching on the physician's territory by offering diagnoses along with their drugs. And at the bottom are the surgeons and barber surgeons, who do the manual work that physicians disdain: cutting, extracting, bleeding, bandaging. The barber surgeon examining your mouth has probably served an apprenticeship, learned his craft through practice, and developed considerable skill through years of experience. He knows anatomy from direct observation, not just from books, but he lacks the theoretical education of a physician, and the medical establishment looks down on him accordingly. This class distinction will gradually erode over the coming centuries, but for now the barber surgeon is a craftsman, not a learned professional. He prods your aching tooth and delivers his verdict: it needs to come out. There's no treatment for a badly decayed tooth in this era. No fillings, no root canals, just extraction. An extraction without anaesthesia, of course, because the drugs that could numb your pain won't be developed for another 200 years. What he can offer you is a swig of strong spirits to take the edge off, and a prayer that he works quickly. The instruments he produces are genuinely alarming. A pelican, a lever-like device for prying out teeth, a dental key, which turns in the socket to loosen the tooth, and various forceps of different sizes. These tools haven't changed much since medieval times and won't change much for centuries to come. The basic mechanics of tooth extraction, grab it and pull, are timeless. You grip the arms of the chair, take that offered swig of brandy, and try to think calming thoughts. The barber surgeon works with practiced efficiency, applying his pelican to the offending tooth, leveraging it this way and that, and then a burst of pain that makes your previous toothache seem trivial, a grinding sensation you'll remember for years, and suddenly it's over. He's holding up the blackened tooth, showing it to you like a trophy, and the bleeding socket in your mouth is already being packed with a wad of linen. You survived. Many people don't, actually. Tooth extraction is a genuinely dangerous procedure, with risks of infection, uncontrolled bleeding, and jaw fracture. The barber surgeon's skill makes a significant difference in outcomes, which is why reputation matters in this trade. The one you chose is competent, and you're lucky for it. But tooth extraction is almost trivial compared to the barber surgeon's other specialty, bloodletting. The theory behind this practice goes back to ancient Greece. The idea that disease results from an imbalance of the 4 humours, and that removing blood can help restore balance. Almost everyone in the 17th century believes in bloodletting, from the poorest labourer to the most educated physician. It's prescribed for everything from fevers to melancholy, to headaches to general malaise. Feeling unwell? Let some blood. Trying to prevent illness? Prophylactic bleeding. The practice is so widespread that barber surgeons sometimes advertise their availability by displaying a bowl of fresh blood in their windows. The technique involves either opening a vein with a lancet or applying leeches to the skin. mere allowing them to suck out the supposedly excess blood. The amount removed varies depending on the patient's condition and the practitioner's judgment, anywhere from a few ounces to a pint or more. From a modern perspective, this practice is at best useless and at worst actively harmful, weakening patients who need their strength and introducing infections through unsterilised instruments. Historians still argue about how many people were actually killed by their medical treatment, but the number is certainly significant. Here's a quirky detail about bloodletting. It's seasonal. The best times for prophylactic bleeding are spring and autumn, following the ancient medical calendars that still govern practice. Different veins are appropriate for different conditions. The cephalic vein for head troubles, the median vein for general purposes. There's an entire elaborate system governing when, where and how much blood to let, all of it based on theory that is completely wrong but internally consistent. You pay the barber surgeon for his services, tooth extraction costs a few pence, well within reach of ordinary people, and step back into the street, your mouth still bleeding sluggishly, and your faith in 17th century medicine shaken but not entirely destroyed. The system has its logic after all, and the practitioners are doing their best with the knowledge available to them. It's just that the knowledge is so terribly, terribly incomplete. And speaking of death, which your visit to the barber surgeon has put firmly in mind, there's an ever-present reality of London life that we haven't yet discussed directly. The plague lurks in the background of everything that happens here, shaping behaviour and belief in ways both obvious and subtle. Let's talk about the disease that every Londoner fears. There's a house on the street ahead of you with a red cross painted on its door. You know what this means before your conscious mind even processes the image. Your 17th century instincts have been well trained. That cross means plague. That house has been sealed, its inhabitants locked inside with their sickness, and no one goes in or out until they recover or die. You cross to the other side of the street, giving the marked house the widest berth the narrow lane allows. Everyone else is doing the same, a flowing river of pedestrians diverting around this obstacle like water around a rock. No one looks directly at the door, no one speaks of it. But everyone knows it's there, and everyone moves a little faster until they're past. The plague is not currently raging in London. The great epidemic of 1665 that will kill perhaps a quarter of the city's population is still some years away. But it never entirely leaves. In good years it simmers in the background, claiming dozens or hundreds of victims. In bad years it explodes into the terrifying conflagration that empties streets and fills mass graves. You can never be sure which kind of year you're in until it's too late. The disease itself is bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and transmitted primarily through the bites of fleas that live on rats. None of this is known to 17th century medicine, of course. The prevailing theory blames miasma, bad air rising from rotting matter, swamps, in and other unwholesome sources. This theory leads to some sensible precautions, avoiding obvious filth, and some useless ones, carrying nosegays or smoking tobacco to ward off the poisonous vapours. Mostly, it leads to fear, because if the very air can kill you, nowhere is truly safe. The symptoms of plague are unmistakable once they appear. A fever, severe headache and muscle pain are followed within hours by the swelling of lymph nodes into the characteristic buboes, painful, egg-sized lumps in the groin, armpit or neck. Without treatment, and there is no effective treatment, death follows within a week in most cases. The pneumonic form, which attacks the lungs, is even faster and even more lethal. If you develop a cough and a high fever, your chances of survival are essentially zero. The city's response to plague is quarantine. When a household shows signs of infection, a watchman is posted at the door and no one is allowed to leave for 40 days, the period that gives quarantine its name. Food is delivered by appointed providers, prayers are said, and the household waits, hoping that the disease will burn itself out rather than spreading to everyone inside. The ethics of this system are genuinely questionable. Sealing healthy family members inside with infected ones dramatically increases their chances of catching the disease, essentially sacrificing the uninfected to protect the community. Historians still argue about whether quarantine helped or hindered the plague's spread, but there's no question that it was cruel to those trapped inside. The authorities also try to control plague through other measures, with varying success. Streets are cleaned more frequently during outbreaks. Fires are lit to purify the air. Gatherings are banned, theatres closed, fairs cancelled. Dogs and cats are killed in large numbers. a tragically counterproductive measure, since cats actually help control the rat population that harbours the plague-carrying fleas. The city's physicians offer advice that is well-meaning but mostly useless, and the quacks and mountebanks who peddle miracle cures do even more harm. Flight is the most effective response to plague, and everyone who can afford it leaves the city when the death toll starts to rise. The wealthy retreat to their country estates. The middling sort find relatives or friends outside London who will take them in. The poor, as usual, are left behind, trapped by poverty in a city that has become a death trap. The streets empty of all but the desperate and the caregivers, and London becomes a ghost town punctuated by the rumble of death carts collecting bodies for the mass graves. But you're visiting during a relatively quiet time, when plague is present but not epidemic. This means you simply live with the background awareness that death might find you at any moment through no fault of your own. That house with the red cross is a reminder, and after you pass it, you find yourself walking a little more quickly, breathing a little more shallowly, noticing the rats that scurry along the gutters with new attention. Here's something that might surprise you about plague. People adapt to it. They have to. You cannot live in a state of constant terror, and so Londoners develop a kind of fatalistic acceptance. The plague will come or it won't. May God's will be done. Life goes on. People work, marry, have children, plan for the future, even while the red crosses multiply on doors and the burial pits fill. This adaptation is psychologically necessary for survival, but it also enables behaviours that spread the disease. Quarantine evaders, secret burials, gatherings that continue despite prohibitions. These are all symptoms of a population that cannot quite believe in its own mortality, even when the evidence is overwhelming. The plague will reach its peak in 1665, in the disaster known as the Great Plague of London. Before it ends, it will kill perhaps 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of the city's population. The death toll is so staggering that it defies comprehension, and yet London will survive, eventually recovering and rebuilding as it always does. By then, however, there will be another disaster to contend with, the Great Fire that will reshape the city just a year later. But that's a story for a future section. For now, you hurry past the marked house and try to focus on the living. Religion offers some comfort in this plague-haunted world, though perhaps not the kind of comfort you'd expect. Let's visit a church and see how 17th century Londoners worship, and how that worship shapes every aspect of their daily lives. The parish church rises before you, its stone tower a landmark visible from streets away. You're about to enter, and you should know that you don't really have a choice in the matter. Church attendance in 17th century England is not optional. It's a legal requirement, enforced by fines and social pressure, and your presence is noted by the church wardens who keep careful records of who shows up and who doesn't. This is the Church of England, the Protestant establishment that has governed English religious life since Henry VIII broke with Rome over a century ago. But the settlement is far from stable. Catholics still practice in secret, hoping for a return to the old faith. Puritans push for further reformation, wanting to strip away the remnants of Catholic ritual and create a purer, more biblical church. And various other sects, Baptists, Quakers, the occasional wild-eyed radical, challenge the establishment from different directions entirely. Religion in 17th century England is not a matter of private belief but of political allegiance, and the stakes could hardly be higher. You enter the church and take your place. The interior is notably bare compared to what a medieval Catholic would have seen. The Reformation stripped away the statues, the paintings, the elaborate rood screens that once decorated English churches. What remains is whitewashed walls, clear glass windows, in most cases, and a prominent pulpit from which the minister delivers sermons that can last 2 hours or more. The focus has shifted from ritual to teaching, from the visual to the verbal. The service begins, and you're expected to stand, sit, and kneel at appropriate moments. This much the Church of England has retained from its Catholic heritage, though the Puritans grumble about such popish practices. The minister reads from the Book of Common Prayer, a standardised liturgy that ensures everyone in England receives more or less the same service. And this standardisation is the point. Uniformity in worship represents uniformity in allegiance, and the prayer book is as much a political document as a religious one. The sermon takes up a substantial portion of the service. This is what Protestant worship is really about. the exposition of scripture, the application of biblical principles to daily life. The minister speaks at length about sin and salvation, about duty and obedience, about the perils that await the ungodly and the rewards promised to the faithful. It's not entertainment exactly, but neither is it boring, at least not to a congregation trained from childhood to listen and absorb. The best preachers are genuine celebrities, drawing crowds from across the city. Historians still argue about how sincerely ordinary people believed what they heard in church. Were they true believers, hanging on every word? Or were they going through the motions, attending because they had to and thinking about dinner the whole time? The truth is probably some mixture. Faith and habit, belief and conformity, all intertwined. What's clear is that the church provided the fundamental framework for understanding reality, why things happen, what happens after death, how to live a good life. Even those who doubted specific doctrines could not escape the Christian worldview that saturated every aspect of culture. Here's something that might interest you about church attendance. The seating is strictly hierarchical. The wealthy have pews at the front, often enclosed in private boxes that separate them from the common herd. The middling sort sit further back, on benches or in lesser pews. The poor stand at the back or in the aisles, if they come at all. Where you sit announces your place in the social order as clearly as your clothes or your occupation. Disputes over seating are common and sometimes bitter, as families fight to maintain or improve their position. Beyond the Sunday service, the church touches every aspect of life. You're baptized there as an infant, married there as an adult, buried there when you die. The parish priest records these events in registers that serve as the basic vital statistics of the community. He also serves as a kind of social worker, administering poor relief, mediating disputes, visiting the sick. The church wardens, lay officials elected by the parish, handle practical matters, maintaining the building, managing church property, presenting moral offenders to the ecclesiastical courts. Those courts are worth a moment's attention. The church has its own legal system, with jurisdiction over matters including marriage, wills, sexual morality, and defamation. If you're accused of adultery, you'll answer to the church court. If your neighbour slanders you by calling you a whore or a thief, you might seek redress there rather than in the secular courts. The punishments handed down are typically penances, public confession of sin, standing in church in a white sheet, rather than imprisonment or fines, though excommunication for the truly obstinate is a serious matter that excludes you from civil society as well as religious life. Religion also provides much of what we would now call entertainment. The church calendar marks the year with festivals and fasts, from Christmas to Easter to the various saints' days that, while somewhat diminished since the Reformation, still provide occasions for celebration. Sermons, as mentioned, are a form of public discourse, and the debates between different religious factions draw audiences as avidly as any theatre. Even those who sneak off to the tavern instead of attending evening prayers are defining themselves in relation to the religious expectations they're defying. You sit through the service, stand through parts of it, kneel through others, and emerge blinking into the daylight. The bells are ringing again, announcing the end of worship, calling people back to their daily concerns. But those concerns are never entirely separate from religion. The sacred and the secular interpenetrate in ways that the modern separation of church and state would make impossible. Speaking of entertainment, though, there's a very different kind of spectacle waiting for you this afternoon. The theatres are open, the bear-baiting arena is active, and London offers pleasures that the churchmen officially disapprove of and unofficially patronise. Let's cross back over to Southwark and see what passes for fun in the 17th century. The flag is flying above the Globe Theatre, which means there's a performance today. You make your way through the afternoon crowds towards Southwark, that strange suburb south of the river where entertainments flourish outside the jurisdiction of the city authorities. It's here that you'll find the theatres, the bear-baiting arenas, the brothels and gaming houses, all the establishments that respectable London officially condemns and practically supports. The Globe rises before you, a circular wooden structure that looks almost fragile from the outside but holds nearly 3,000 people when fully packed. This is the theatre where Shakespeare's plays are performed, where the Lord Chamberlain's men, later the King's men, staged the dramatic works that will define English literature for centuries. You're here at a remarkable moment in cultural history, though of course you don't know that. you're just looking for an afternoon's entertainment. You pay your penny at the door and enter the yard, the open central area directly in front of the stage. Here, standing room only, pressed together with your fellow groundlings, you'll watch the performance from below, looking up at the actors on the raised platform. The wealthy sit in the galleries that ring the yard, protected from the weather by the thatched roof that covers everything except the centre. The very wealthy sit on the stage itself, visible to everyone, making sure that their presence at the theatre is as much a performance as anything the actors do. The audience settles, or rather doesn't settle, because theatrical audiences in this era are notoriously rowdy. People eat, drink, talk, heckle, and move about freely. If the play is boring, they let the actors know. If it's good, they cheer and stomp and demand encores. This is not the hushed reverence of a modern theatre. It's more like a sporting event, with all the noise and energy that implies. The actors have to project over the din, have to capture and hold attention through sheer force of performance, and what performances they are. The stage has no curtain, no elaborate sets, minimal props. A sign might announce a forest or a battlefield, and the audience imagines the rest. The actors wear elaborate costumes, the theatre companies spend lavishly on clothing, which is their main visual spectacle. But everything else depends on words and bodies. When Hamlet speaks of Denmark, you see Denmark in your mind. When Romeo and Juliet die, you feel it in your gut. The limitations force an imaginative engagement that later, more visually elaborate theatres will actually diminish. Here's something that might surprise you about these performances. All the female roles are played by boys. Women are not permitted on the English stage, a prohibition that won't be lifted until the Restoration in 1660. So the great heroines of Shakespeare, Juliet, Desdemona, Lady Macbeth, are all portrayed by young men whose voices haven't broken yet, apprentice actors trained in female impersonation. This strikes modern audiences as strange, but it was simply the convention of the time, and audiences accepted it without apparent difficulty. Historians still argue about how audiences in this era actually experienced these performances. Did they lose themselves in the story, forgetting that Juliet was really a boy? Or did they maintain an awareness of the artifice, enjoying the skill of the performance even while recognising its constructed nature? The plays themselves often comment on this ambiguity, with characters disguised across gender lines, creating layers of irony that would have been obvious to the original audiences and are sometimes lost on us today. The play you're watching today might be a comedy, a tragedy, a history, or some combination. The repertory system means that companies perform a different play almost every day, keeping an astonishing number of scripts in active rotation. Actors memorise their parts from individual sides, scrolls containing only their own lines with brief cues, rather than from complete scripts. The pace is demanding, the preparation minimal, the performances necessarily somewhat rough-hewn, but the energy is undeniable, and the connection between performers and audience is electric. After the play, you might wander next door to the bear baiting arena. This is exactly what it sounds like. A circular pit where bears are chained to a post and attacked by dogs, while spectators watch from surrounding galleries. It's brutal, bloody, and enormously popular. Both royalty and commoners attend, and the distinction between a theatre and a bear pit is not as clear as we might assume. The same Southwark entertainment district contains both, and audiences move between them freely. The bears are valuable property, they're expensive to acquire and maintain, so the dogs are typically the ones who die. The bear, wounded but surviving, fights again another day. Occasionally a bear is killed, and this is considered a special entertainment worth advertising. There are also bull baiting, cockfighting, and various other blood sports that strike modern sensibilities as horrifying, but were entirely mainstream in the 17th century. The same people who wept at Romeo and Juliet cheered as dogs tore into a chained animal, and they saw no contradiction. This might seem hypocritical, but it reflects a genuinely different understanding of the relationship between humans and animals. Animals exist for human use, in this worldview, for food, for labour, for entertainment. They're not believed to have souls or to suffer in any morally significant way. The cruelty that we see, they simply didn't perceive as cruelty. This is not a defence of the practice, just an acknowledgement that moral intuitions vary across time and culture, and that people in the past were not simply modern people in funny clothes. The afternoon is fading now, and the entertainments are winding down. But there's one more form of public spectacle that we need to discuss. One that draws crowds even larger than the theatres: public punishment. The justice system of 17th century London is nothing if not theatrical, and its performances are considerably more disturbing than anything you've seen at the Globe. The crowd is gathering at Tyburn, the public execution ground at the western edge of the city, where the road to Oxford passes through what will someday become Marble Arch. You don't particularly want to be here. The whole concept is horrifying to your modern sensibilities, but you need to understand this if you're going to understand 17th century London. Public punishment is not just a feature of the justice system. It's a central ritual of community life, attended by enormous crowds and treated as something between a morality play and a sporting event. The gallows at Tyburn is a triangular structure nicknamed the Triple Tree, capable of hanging up to 24 people at once. Today's execution involves a smaller number: a thief, a murderer, and a coiner, someone who clipped or counterfeited currency, which is technically treason. They've been brought here in a cart from Newgate Prison, travelling through streets lined with spectators, stopping at taverns along the way to drink the final cups that tradition allows condemned prisoners. The procession is part of the spectacle, transforming execution day into a parade. The crowd gathered at Tyburn is huge, thousands of people of all social classes dressed for an outing. Vendors sell food and drink, pickpockets work the edges. The best viewing spots have been claimed since dawn, and some people have paid to sit in specially constructed stands that offer premium sightlines. This is entertainment, though of a peculiar kind. These are the reality shows of the 17th century, offering spectacles of suffering that the audience consumes with complicated emotions: horror, excitement, pity, and a kind of there but for the grace of God relief. The prisoners mount the scaffold and are expected to give speeches. This is their moment of fame, perhaps the only time in their lives that anyone has listened to what they have to say. Convention demands that they confess their crimes, warn the young against following their path, and express faith in divine mercy despite their sins. Most follow this script, some do not. The defiant prisoner who proclaims innocence to the last, who dies cursing the judge and jury, becomes a figure of folklore, a kind of criminal celebrity whose last words are printed and sold in broadside ballads. The actual hanging is quick, but not instantaneous. There's no drop. The prisoner simply stands on the cart, the noose is placed around their neck, and the cart drives away, leaving them to strangle at the end of the rope. Death can take minutes, and it's customary for friends and family to pull on the condemned person's legs to hasten the end. This is considered an act of mercy, a way of shortening the suffering, and no one interferes. For certain crimes, death alone is not considered sufficient. Traitors are hanged, drawn, and quartered. Hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still alive, their entrails burned before their eyes, before finally being beheaded, and their bodies cut into pieces for display. Women convicted of treason, including petty treason, the murder of a husband or master, are burned at the stake, though the executioner usually strangles them first as an act of mercy before the flames take hold. These extreme punishments are relatively rare, reserved for the most serious offences against the state, but their existence casts a shadow over the entire system. Lesser punishments are similarly public and similarly theatrical. The pillory holds offenders immobile in a public square, where passers-by can express their disapproval by throwing whatever comes to hand: rotten vegetables if they're sympathetic, stones and excrement if they're not. Some people have died in the pillory, pelted to death by hostile crowds. The stocks serve a similar function for minor offences. Whipping, branding and ear cropping are all performed in public, designed to shame as much as to punish. Historians still argue about the purpose and effectiveness of these public punishments. The official justification was deterrence. If people saw what happened to criminals, they would be less likely to commit crimes themselves. Whether this actually worked is questionable. Crime rates don't seem to have been notably lower despite the severity of punishments. But deterrence may not have been the only point. Public punishment also served as a ritual of community solidarity, affirming shared values by demonstrating what happened to those who violated them, and it provided entertainment in an era with limited options. Here's something that might interest you about the condemned. They were celebrities of a sort. Famous criminals had their stories told in popular ballads, their last dying speeches printed and sold. The audience at an execution might include people who had followed the criminal's trial, who knew the details of their crimes, who felt a personal connection to the drama unfolding before them. This is not unlike our own fascination with true crime podcasts and murder documentaries. The appetite for tales of transgression and punishment seems to be a constant of human psychology. The execution concludes, the bodies are cut down, and the crowd begins to disperse. You feel shaken. This is not something you can witness unmoved, regardless of how you contextualize it historically. But you've learned something important about this world. Death is public here, in a way it will not be in later centuries. Birth, death, punishment, celebration. The major events of human life happen in full view of the community, witnessed and shared. The privacy that modern people take for granted simply does not exist. The afternoon is wearing on, and you've seen enough of death for one day. But there's another catastrophe lurking in London's future, one that will reshape the city far more dramatically than any number of executions. The Great Fire of 1666 is approaching, and though you're visiting before that disaster, its shadow falls over everything. Let's talk about fire, the constant danger, the inadequate preparation, and the conflagration that will change London forever. It's a September evening, and you're walking through Pudding Lane, a narrow street near the wharves where goods from all over the world are unloaded and stored. The shops and houses here are timber-framed as everywhere in the city. Their upper stories jutting out over the street until neighbours on opposite sides could almost touch hands across the gap. The air smells of pitch and tar, of stored grain and dry hay, of the coal smoke that never quite dissipates. And underneath it all tonight there's something else, a whiff of something burning. Fire is a constant danger in 17th century London. The city is built almost entirely of wood. Its buildings press so close together that flames can leap from roof to roof like a living thing. Chimneys are often poorly maintained, and sparks from badly swept flues start fires with terrifying regularity. Candles tip over, cooking fires spread, forges and kilns malfunction. The night watch includes checking for fires, and every parish keeps firefighting equipment. Buckets, hooks for pulling down burning buildings, hand-operated pumps, but the equipment is primitive and the organisation is improvised. The fire that starts in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of September the 2nd, 1666, is not unusual in itself. Bakery fires happen all the time. Open flames, stored flour dust, tired workers falling asleep. Farriner will later swear that he checked his ovens before going to bed, and maybe he did. It doesn't matter. By 1 a.m, his house is ablaze, and the flames are spreading to neighbouring buildings. What makes this fire different is a combination of factors that, in retrospect, seems almost designed to produce catastrophe. The summer of 1666 has been dry, months without significant rain, leaving the wooden city parched and ready to burn. A strong easterly wind is blowing, and fanning the flames westward and carrying sparks far ahead of the fire front. And the area where the fire starts is packed with combustible materials, not just the usual wood and thatch, but warehoused goods like oil, pitch, hemp and tallow that turn ordinary buildings into fuel depots. The Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, is woken with news of the fire. He comes, he looks, he famously declares that a woman might piss it out, and he goes back to bed. This dismissal will haunt him for the rest of his life. By the time he's convinced to take the fire seriously, it's already too late. The flames have spread to warehouses on Thames Street, where they find enough fuel to burn for days. The next 3 days are hell. The fire spreads faster than people can flee, destroying everything in its path. Houses, churches, public buildings, the accumulated wealth of centuries. The medieval St. Paul's Cathedral, already in disrepair, becomes an inferno when the lead of its roof melts and flows down like water. The stones themselves crack and explode in the heat. The Royal Exchange, the centre of London's commerce, is reduced to a smoking shell. Whole neighbourhoods simply cease to exist. People flee with what they can carry, clogging the streets and the river with refugees and their possessions. The wealthy load goods onto carts and boats. The poor carry bundles on their backs. Many bury valuables in their gardens, hoping to return and dig them up. Some will, some won't. Pets are abandoned, the elderly and sick are carried by relatives or left behind, and the famous diarist Samuel Pepys buries his wine and his cheese in his garden. Priorities that reveal something about his character. The fire burns itself out only when it runs out of fuel, partly because it reaches the open spaces at the edge of the city, partly because the wind dies down, and partly because organised demolition finally creates fire breaks wide enough to stop the flames. The Duke of York, the King's brother, personally leads some of these efforts, earning a reputation for decisive action that will serve him well in his eventual disastrous reign as James II. When it's over, more than 13,000 houses have been destroyed, along with 87 churches and most of the major public buildings within the city walls. Roughly 400 acres lie in smoking ruins, the entire heart of medieval London gone in 3 days. Remarkably, the recorded death toll is only a handful of people, though historians suspect the real number is higher, the poor and homeless leaving no records when they died. Historians still argue about the long-term effects of the Great Fire. It destroys the medieval city, certainly, but it also provides an opportunity for rebuilding on more rational lines. The new London that rises from the ashes is built of brick and stone, with wider streets and stricter building codes. It's cleaner, safer, and more orderly than what came before. Some see this as a blessing in disguise. Others point out that the poor who lost everything in the fire rarely benefited from the rebuilding. But you're visiting before all this, in a London that still has years of existence ahead of it. The wooden houses still lean over the streets, the warehouses still bulge with combustible goods, and the fire that will consume it all is still nothing but potential, a spark waiting to be struck. You walk through Pudding Lane without knowing what history it will make, and the city feels solid and permanent around you, as cities always do before they burn. The evening's coming on, and you've had a long day of witnessing. Let's shift our focus to something gentler, or at least different. The lives of women in 17th century London operate under constraints that would seem unbearable to a modern person, yet within those constraints, women find ways to exercise agency, build lives, and even flourish. Let's see what it's like to be female in Stuart London. You've been walking through London all day, seeing the city through what has mostly been a masculine perspective. The trades you've observed are practiced primarily by men. The public spaces you've visited are dominated by men. The entertainments you've witnessed cater primarily to male tastes, but women make up half the population, and their lives, while constrained in ways that would strike a modern person as intolerable, are neither simple nor uniform. If you're born female in 17th century London, your life trajectory is largely predetermined by your social class. If you're from a wealthy family, you'll be educated at home in needlework, music, perhaps some reading and writing, and the domestic arts that will make you a suitable wife. If you're from the middling sort, you might learn enough literacy to keep household accounts, plus whatever practical skills your mother can teach you. If you're poor, you'll work from childhood, as a servant, a shop girl, yet a worker in one of the few trades that admit women. Marriage is the central event of most women's lives, the transition from dependence on a father to dependence on a husband. The legal doctrine of coverture holds that a married woman has no legal existence separate from her husband. She cannot own property in her own name, cannot make contracts, cannot sue or be sued. Her husband controls her body, her labour, and any wages she might earn. In exchange, he's required to support her and their children, but the exchange is drastically unequal by modern standards. And yet, within this system, women find ways to exercise power and agency. The household is a woman's domain, and running a household in this era is no small matter. The mistress of a house supervises servants, manages food production and preservation, maintains the family's social obligations, and often helps with her husband's business. In many trades, wives and widows play essential roles, keeping accounts, dealing with customers, managing supplies. When a tradesman dies, his widow often continues the business, admitted to the guild by right of her marriage, even if she wasn't trained in the craft herself. Here's something that might surprise you about women's work in this era. It's more varied than later centuries will allow. The strict separation of men's work and women's work is a development of the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 1600s, the boundaries are more porous. Women work as brewers, bakers, butchers. They run taverns and ordinaries. They serve as midwives, a profession that is almost exclusively female and that carries considerable authority. The medical establishment is beginning to challenge midwifery, with male physicians claiming expertise in childbirth, but most births in this era are still attended by women who have learned their craft through apprenticeship and experience. Childbirth itself is perhaps the defining experience of women's lives, not because it happens once, but because it happens repeatedly. The average married woman in this era might give birth to 8 or 10 children over her fertile years, though many of these children will not survive infancy. The process is dangerous. Death in childbirth is common enough that women often make their wills when they know they're pregnant. The midwife's skill can make the difference between life and death, but even the best midwife cannot prevent the hemorrhages, infections, and complications that claim so many mothers. Historians still argue about maternal mortality rates in this era. The records are incomplete and definitions vary, but the best estimates suggest that perhaps 1 in 30 births results in the mother's death. This sounds relatively small, but remember that each woman faces this risk multiple times. Over a lifetime of childbearing, the cumulative risk is substantial. Women's letters and diaries reveal a genuine fear of pregnancy, however much they may have wanted children. For women who don't marry, and there are many, perhaps 10 to 15% of the adult female population, the options are limited. A spinster, the word originally referred to women who spun thread, the most common occupation for unmarried women, might live with relatives, earning her keep through domestic labour. She might work as a servant in another household. She might practice one of the trades open to women, though without a husband's support, economic survival is precarious. Convents, which provided an alternative to marriage in Catholic countries, have been dissolved in Protestant England. There is no respectable institutional life available for women who choose not to marry. The alternative to respectable spinsterhood is the sex trade, which flourishes in London despite official condemnation. The Suffolk stews, brothels, are technically illegal but practically tolerated. Prostitution is everywhere, from the grand courtesans who serve wealthy clients to the desperate women who sell themselves in alleys for pennies. Some women enter the trade by choice, seeing it as preferable to the alternatives. Many are forced into it by poverty, abandonment, or abuse. The legal system punishes prostitutes, but rarely their clients, a double standard that will persist for centuries. Women's voices are largely absent from the official records of this era. They don't sit in Parliament, don't plead cases in court, don't write the treatises and histories that document the period, but they're not silent. Women write letters, keep diaries, compose poetry and prayers. A few manage to publish their work, though this is considered somewhat unseemly for respectable women. And in the daily commerce of gossip and conversation, women's voices shape opinion, spread news, and influence decisions in ways that the official record doesn't capture. The evening is deepening, and your tour of women's lives has reminded you of something. Everyone you've been meeting started as a child, and childhood in 17th century London is a very different experience from what modern children know. Let's look at what it means to grow up in this world, the dangers, the expectations, and the surprisingly short journey from infancy to adult responsibility. There's a child watching you from a doorway, a small figure in a miniature version of adult clothing, with the serious expression that 17th century portraits always give to children. She might be 5 or 6, old enough to be useful, young enough that her survival to adulthood is far from certain. She is, in a very real sense, the future of this city, though she carries that weight without knowing it, as children always do. Childhood in 17th century London is brief, not because children are treated cruelly, though some certainly are, but because the concept of childhood as a protected, extended period of play and learning simply doesn't exist in its modern form. Children are small adults, expected to contribute to the household economy as soon as they're physically capable, trained into their future roles almost from birth. The idea that childhood is a special time, distinct from adulthood and requiring special treatment, is just beginning to emerge among educated elites. For most people, it would seem like sentimental nonsense. Infancy, however, is universal and universally dangerous. Babies in this era die at appalling rates, perhaps 20 to 30% in their first year, more in cities than in the countryside. The causes are multiple: infectious diseases, contaminated food and water, or accidents, and a host of conditions that modern medicine would consider easily treatable. The medical understanding of infant care is minimal, and some common practices are actively harmful. The widespread use of opiates to quiet fussy babies, for instance, certainly caused some deaths, though parents had no way of knowing this. One practice that strikes modern readers as particularly strange is swaddling, wrapping infants tightly in bands of cloth so that they can barely move. This isn't cruelty. It's a sincere belief that babies need to have their limbs held straight to prevent them from growing crooked, plus a practical necessity when you need to put the baby somewhere safe while you work. A tightly swaddled infant can be hung on a peg, propped in a corner, or otherwise secured while the mother does the 1,000 tasks that household survival requires. The practice will gradually fall out of favour over the next century, but for now it's simply what you do with babies. Children who survive infancy are put to work as soon as they're able. By age 4 or 5, a child in a middling household might be helping with simple chores, fetching water, carrying messages, watching younger siblings. By 7 or 8, they're doing real work, spinning, cleaning, running errands, learning the basics of whatever trade the family practices. Childhood play exists, certainly. Children have always played. But it's squeezed into the margins of a schedule dominated by labour and religious instruction. Here's a detail that might interest you. Apprenticeship typically begins around age 12 or 14. But for some trades and some families it can start much younger. A child might be sent away from home at age 7 or 8 to begin learning a trade in another household, working as a servant and trainee combined. This seems harsh by modern standards, but it reflects economic realities. A family with many children and limited resources might not be able to feed all of them, and placing a child in an apprenticeship ensures that they'll eat, learn a trade, and eventually become self-supporting. Education, in the formal sense, is available to some children but not most. Grammar schools exist, teaching Latin and classical learning to boys who might go on to university or the professions. Some wealthy families hire tutors. Charity schools provide basic literacy to the deserving poor, but for most children, education means learning whatever skills they need for their future work, taught by parents, masters, or the informal networks of family and community. Girls rarely receive any formal education at all, though some learn to read and write at home. The children you see in the streets of London are working, apprentices running errands, young servants carrying goods, girls selling matches or nuts, or whatever small commodities can earn a few pennies. They're dressed in adult styles, scaled down, the same doublets and breeches, the same caps and aprons. They're expected to behave with adult decorum, to show respect to their betters, to work hard and complain little. The indulgent sentimentality that later centuries will direct toward children is largely absent. This is a world where children need to grow up fast because many of them won't grow up at all. Historians still argue about whether parents in this era loved their children less because so many died, or whether the frequency of child death made surviving children even more precious. The evidence is mixed. You can find parents who seem coldly resigned to infant mortality, and parents who are devastated by the death of a child. Human emotional responses are complex, and generalizations across an entire society are always suspect. What's clear is that the children who survive to adulthood are tough. They've been exposed to disease, witnessed death, experienced hardship that would traumatize many modern children. They enter their adult lives with few illusions about the world's difficulty, prepared for a life of hard work and uncertain outcomes. This toughness is an adaptation, necessary for survival in a world without safety nets or modern medicine. The child in the doorway ducks back inside as you approach, called by a parent's voice. You walk on, thinking about the fragility and resilience of children in every era, about how different and how similar the experience of childhood has been across the centuries. But there's something new in London's air tonight. A stimulating, bitter, exotic smell wafting from an establishment ahead. The coffee houses have arrived, and they're changing everything. The sign above the door shows a Turkish man holding a cup, and the smell emanating from within is unlike anything else in London. Bitter, roasted, somehow both harsh and enticing. You push open the door and enter one of the city's new coffee houses, establishments that have only existed in London for a few years, but are already transforming how people meet, talk, and do business. Coffee arrived in England in the 1650s, introduced by traders and travellers who had encountered it in the Ottoman Empire. The first coffee house in London opened around 1652, and within a decade there were dozens of them, clustered particularly in the commercial districts around the Royal Exchange. By the end of the century there will be hundreds. This is the beginning of a caffeine revolution that will reshape English society. You pay your penny at the door, the standard admission price, which gets you a seat, a dish of coffee and access to the newspapers and conversation, and find a spot at one of the long tables that fill the room. The space is simple compared to a tavern. No alcohol is served, no gambling is allowed, and the decor is functional rather than luxurious. What draws people here is not sensory pleasure, but intellectual stimulation. This is a place to hear news, debate ideas, and make deals. The coffee itself takes some getting used to. It's brewed thick and bitter, served without milk or sugar, both of which are expensive luxuries, in small dishes that allow it to cool quickly. The taste is harsh to your palate, accustomed as it is to modern brewing methods and sweeteners. But the effect is undeniable. Within minutes of drinking, you feel more alert, more focused, your mind sharpened in a way that ale never achieves. This is why people come here. The coffee wakes you up and keeps you awake, allowing for conversations and transactions that the soporific effects of alcohol would blur. The clientele is diverse, or rather diverse in one dimension. Men of all social classes mingle here, the penny admission fee creating a kind of equality that exists nowhere else in English society. A merchant sits next to a clerk, a gentleman next to a tradesman, all focused on the newspapers and pamphlets that circulate freely around the room. The coffee house has developed its own etiquette. Disputes are settled with words, not violence. Anyone's opinion may be offered on any subject, and the elaborate hierarchies of deference that govern the rest of English society are temporarily suspended. But women are notably absent. The coffee houses are explicitly masculine spaces, and women who enter them risk their reputations. This exclusion provokes some famous satirical responses. A petition supposedly authored by women complaining that their husbands spend too much time in coffee houses, emerging impotent and tedious, but the exclusion persists. The coffee house is where men go to escape domestic life, and part of its appeal is precisely this homosocial atmosphere. Here's something remarkable about the coffee houses. They're becoming specialised. Different establishments attract different crowds, and serious participants in various fields know which coffee house to frequent. Lloyd's Coffee House will become the centre of shipping insurance. Jonathan's Coffee House in Exchange Alley will host the trading that becomes the London Stock Exchange. Specific coffee houses serve as gathering places for scientists, for poets, for political factions. The coffee house is not just a place to drink, it's a node in the networks through which information, money and ideas flow. Historians still argue about the role of coffee houses in the development of the public sphere, that realm of debate and opinion between the state and private life that many scholars see as essential to democracy. The coffee houses certainly provided a space for the kind of free-ranging political discussion that had not previously existed in English culture. Whether this directly led to more democratic governance, or whether the coffee houses merely reflected changes that were happening anyway, is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. The government, unsurprisingly, is suspicious of these establishments. Charles II will attempt to close them in 1675, worried about the seditious conversations that might take place when men gather to drink coffee and talk politics. The attempt fails. The coffee houses are too popular, too economically important, too deeply embedded in London's commercial life. But the attempt itself reveals how disruptive these establishments seem to the authorities. A place where commoners discuss affairs of state, where news circulates without official control, where opinions are formed outside the channels of church and crown. This is potentially subversive. You finish your coffee feeling the unfamiliar buzz of caffeine sharpening your perceptions. The conversation around you has ranged from trade policy to theological controversy to the latest scandals at court, all discussed with an animated energy that the more sedate tavern atmosphere rarely achieves. So you understand now why these places are catching on, why they're multiplying across the city, why they seem to represent something new in English social life. But the light coming through the coffee house windows is fading, and you realise with some anxiety that evening is approaching. In 17th century London, darkness brings a whole new set of dangers. The city that was merely challenging during the day becomes actively threatening after dark. Let's step outside and see what happens when the sun goes down on Stuart London. The sun is setting and London is transforming. The already dim streets are growing darker, the shadows deepening between the overhanging buildings. Shopkeepers are closing their shutters, merchants are heading home, and a different population is emerging. Those who work the night shift of this city's less reputable industries, and those who prey on anyone foolish or unfortunate enough to be out after dark. There are no streetlights. Let that sink in for a moment, because it's hard for a modern person to truly grasp. The streets you've been walking all day, already narrow and crowded and dangerous, become in darkness a kind of maze where you can barely see your own feet. The only illumination comes from the occasional lantern hung outside a tavern door, the flicker of candles through window shutters, and whatever starlight or moonlight manages to penetrate London's perpetual haze of coal smoke. On a cloudy night, the darkness is nearly absolute. Navigating this darkness requires help, and for this purpose, London has link boys, children and young men who carry torches or lanterns, hiring themselves out to guide travellers through the nighttime streets. You negotiate a price with a boy who appears at your elbow almost the moment the light starts to fail, and he lights his torch and sets off, expecting you to follow. The torch throws a small circle of flickering light that seems almost swallowed by the surrounding blackness, but it's enough to see by, enough to avoid the worst obstacles, enough to signal to potential predators that you're not entirely helpless, because predators there are. The night belongs to a different London than the day, a London of cut purses and footpads, prostitutes and pimps, gangs of young men looking for trouble or profit, and criminals of every description. The watch patrols the streets, in theory, Sus is calling out the hours and keeping an eye out for trouble. In practice, the watch is understaffed, underpaid, often elderly or infirm, and generally more interested in reaching the end of their shift unscathed than in confronting dangerous criminals. Many watchmen are local tradesmen serving their turn at a civic duty they'd rather avoid. They're not trained law enforcement. The standard greeting if you encounter the watch is "God give you good night," to which they respond with the hour and the weather, past midnight and a cloudy night. This ritual exchange identifies you as a peaceful citizen going about legitimate business. Failure to respond appropriately raises suspicion. But the watch can be bribed, evaded, or simply avoided by anyone who knows the streets well, and experienced criminals certainly do. Here's something that might surprise you about nighttime crime. Much of it is surprisingly petty. Professional thieves certainly exist, some of them well organised and quite dangerous. But a lot of nighttime crime is opportunistic. A drunk rolled in an alley, a purse cut from a belt, a cloak snatched from shoulders. The poverty that fills London's back streets produces desperation, and desperation produces crime that is more sad than sophisticated. The hanging offences that fill the courts are often for property crimes worth a few shillings, enough to get you killed, but not enough to meaningfully change your circumstances. The darkness also provides cover for activities that are not criminal but not quite respectable. The brothels of Southwark and other areas do their best business after dark. Gambling dens open their doors. Taverns that would close at a reasonable hour in daytime stay open for those with business or pleasure that can't wait for morning. And ordinary people conduct affairs, settle scores, meet secretly for reasons they'd rather not explain. The night has its own economy, parallel to the day's, and its own rules. You stick close to your link boy, watching the shadows nervously. The streets that seemed merely unpleasant during the day now feel actively menacing. Every doorway might hide someone waiting to rob you. Every dark figure might be a threat. Your link boy seems unbothered. This is his world, after all, and he knows its rhythms, but you're painfully aware of your vulnerability. If something happens to you here, no one will know until morning, and maybe not even then. The link boy stops suddenly, holding his torch high, and you realise he's spotted something ahead. A group of young men blocking the street, their intentions unclear. He backtracks smoothly, leading you through a side alley you would never have found on your own, emerging on a different street that leads to your destination. This is the skill you're paying for, not just the light, but the knowledge of how to navigate this nighttime city, which routes are safe and which are not, when to confront and when to avoid. Eventually you reach your lodgings and you pay the link boy generously. He's earned it. The door closes behind you, and you're safe, more or less in the relative security of a building with walls and locks. But sleep in 17th century London is not like sleep in your own time. The rhythms of rest follow patterns that modern science has only recently begun to understand. And your night is not yet over. Let's discover the strange world of segmented sleep. You're exhausted, and the bed, such as it is, looks more inviting than any bed has ever looked. You peel off layers of clothing, perform whatever ablutions are possible with the basin and pitcher provided, and crawl under the blankets. The mattress rustles beneath you, straw again, though decent quality, and you close your eyes, expecting the oblivion of sleep. But sleep in the 17th century doesn't work the way you expect. What happens instead is this. You fall asleep fairly quickly, tired from the day's exertions. You sleep deeply for several hours, the kind of dense, dreamless unconsciousness that your body desperately needs. And then, sometime around midnight or shortly after, you wake up. Not groggily, not reluctantly, but clearly, completely awake, as if someone had flipped a switch in your brain. This is first sleep, and what follows is not insomnia in the modern sense. It's a normal part of the sleep cycle that most people in this era experience, a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night that can last an hour or two before you drift off into second sleep and slumber until morning. The pattern is so common that it has its own vocabulary, its own expectations, its own rituals. What do people do during this midnight waking? Many things. Some pray. This is considered an especially pious time for devotion, when the world is quiet and the mind is clear. Some get up and do small tasks around the house, take care of the fire, check on children or animals. Some couples use the time for intimate conversation or physical intimacy. Medical writers of the era actually recommend this as the best time for conception, when the body is relaxed and the mind is tranquil. Some people simply lie awake and think. In an era without constant stimulation, without screens and notifications and the endless demands of modern connectivity, the quiet hours after midnight offer a kind of mental space that is increasingly rare in our own world. Writers and thinkers describe these hours as especially conducive to reflection, to working through problems, to a particular quality of insight that comes when the ordinary distractions of daily life have fallen away. Here's what's fascinating about this pattern. It seems to be the natural human sleep cycle, suppressed in modern life by artificial lighting and changed social expectations. When researchers put subjects in conditions mimicking pre-industrial lighting, 14 hours of darkness per day, the subjects naturally begin sleeping in two segments, with a period of wakefulness between. We've been trained out of segmented sleep, but our bodies may still remember it. Historians still argue about how universal this pattern was. Not everyone mentions it in their diaries and letters, and some people seem to have slept through the night even in pre-modern conditions. But the evidence for the prevalence of segmented sleep is strong enough that it's reshaped how we understand historical sleep patterns. All those references in old texts to first sleep and second sleep, which were long dismissed as metaphorical or unclear, turn out to be literal descriptions of a common experience. Your midnight waking passes gently. You lie in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling around you, the creak of timbers, the rustle of other sleepers, the distant bark of a dog. The church bells chime midnight, or perhaps 1 o'clock, marking time in their patient bronze voices. You think about everything you've seen today, this strange old London that is both foreign and familiar, brutal and beautiful, utterly unlike your world and yet recognisably human. Eventually you feel drowsiness returning. Your eyes grow heavy, your thoughts begin to drift, and you slide into second sleep, deeper and more restful than the first, carrying you through to morning. This is how humans have slept for most of history, this doubled rhythm of rest and waking. And there's something almost peaceful about surrendering to it, letting your body follow its ancient patterns instead of fighting them. When you wake again, the grey light of another London morning is seeping through the shutters. You've slept as people have slept for thousands of years, and you feel strangely rested despite the interruption. Or perhaps because of it. The midnight waking gave your mind time to process the day's experiences, to sort and store and make sense of everything. You're ready for another day in Stuart London, but first, let's take a moment to see how the other half lives. The wealthy experience this city very differently from the middling sort we've been following. You wake to a different London this morning, not the cramped lodging house you've been staying in, but the townhouse of a wealthy merchant. One of the men who've made fortunes in the expanding trade that's bringing goods from all over the world to England's shores. You've been granted a glimpse of how the prosperous live, and while it's certainly more comfortable than what you've experienced so far, it's not quite the paradise you might expect. The house is larger, certainly. Instead of 1 or 2 rooms, there are many. A parlour for receiving guests, a dining room for formal meals, a kitchen in the back, and multiple bedchambers on the upper floors. The furniture is finer, carved and upholstered, displaying the wealth of the owner in visible, tangible form. Tapestries hang on the walls, both for decoration and for warmth. Glass windows, actual glass, not just shutters, let in light while keeping out the worst of the weather. This is what success looks like in 17th century London. But look closer, and the differences from your own experience are less dramatic than they first appear. The house is still heated by fires, and while there are more fireplaces than in a poorer home, the rooms away from those fires are still cold. The windows are glass, but glass in this era is expensive and often of poor quality, wavy, bubbled, letting in light but distorting any view. The sanitation is marginally better. The household has a proper privy rather than a shared cesspit. But the fundamental challenges of waste disposal remain the same. And the smell. The smell is perhaps slightly less oppressive, but it's still there. The background note of coal smoke and human habitation that permeates everything. The wealthy eat better, certainly. The breakfast table you sit down to offers choices that would be luxuries for most Londoners. Fine white bread, butter, perhaps some chocolate. A new and fashionable drink, even more exotic than coffee. Cold meats, preserves. The meal is served on pewter plates rather than wooden trenchers, and there are forks, those newfangled Italian implements that are just beginning to catch on among the fashionable set. The food is more varied, more elaborately prepared, reflecting a household that can afford to employ a cook. Here's something that might interest you about wealthy households. They're busy places, full of servants. A prosperous merchant's family might employ a dozen or more people. Cooks, maids, footmen, a coachman, personal attendants. These servants live in the house, sleeping in attics and back rooms, eating in the kitchen, working from before dawn until after dark. The household is not just a home but a workplace, and the distinction between family and staff is both clear and constantly negotiated. The lady of the house rises later than her servants, but her day is not idle. She manages this domestic enterprise, supervising the work of the staff, maintaining household accounts, ensuring that everything runs smoothly. She receives visitors, maintains social connections that are essential to her husband's business and the family's standing. She supervises the education of her children, oversees the care of the sick, manages the charitable obligations that are expected of prosperous families. It's work, even if it's not recognised as such by the same standards applied to her husband's commercial activities. The wealthy also have access to medical care that is, if not actually better, at least more elaborate. A physician will attend them, prescribing treatments based on humoral theory, and charging substantial fees for the privilege. Whether these treatments actually help is questionable. The wealthy may actually suffer worse health outcomes from too much medical attention, subjected to bleeding and purging that weaken rather than strengthen them. But the attention itself is a marker of status, proof that you can afford the best care available. Historians still argue about whether wealth actually improved quality of life in this era, or whether it merely changed the nature of the problems one faced. The wealthy certainly ate better and lived in more comfortable houses, but they were not immune to the diseases that ravaged the population and some of the advantages of wealth, rich food, and sedentary lifestyles. Overzealous medical treatment may have shortened lives as often as they extended them. What wealth did provide unambiguously was choice. The wealthy could flee the city during plague outbreaks, retreating to country estates. They could afford to educate their children, to endow their daughters with dowries that secured good marriages, to establish their sons in professions or trades. They could travel, see the world, engage with ideas and people beyond the narrow confines of a single neighbourhood. Freedom, in 17th century London as in most times and places, is largely a function of money. The wealthy household you're visiting has connections to trade that reach across the globe, interest in shipping, in colonial ventures, in the exchange of goods that is slowly knitting the world into a single commercial system. This is a moment of transformation, when England is becoming a global power, and the profits of that transformation are creating new forms of wealth and new kinds of wealthy people. The world is changing, and if you know how to catch the currents, you can ride them to prosperity. But for all that, even the wealthy live in a world saturated with magic and superstition, where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural are porous and uncertain. Let's step out of this comfortable house and into the realm of belief that shapes how everyone in 17th century London understands their world. You pass an old woman on the street and she mutters something under her breath as you go by, a blessing or a curse, you're not sure which. For a moment you feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. In 17th century London, such encounters carry weight. The supernatural is not a quaint superstition to be dismissed by educated people. It's a real and present force in daily life, shaping behaviour and belief in ways that would seem bizarre to a modern rationalist. Let's be clear about what people in this era actually believe. God exists, absolutely and unquestionably, an active presence in human affairs who rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. Satan exists too, along with his legions of demons, constantly working to tempt humans into sin and damnation. Angels watch over the faithful. The dead may walk as ghosts, whether to complete unfinished business or as warnings to the living. And witches, women, mostly, who have made pacts with the devil, work their maleficent magic among the population, cursing their enemies and causing harm through supernatural means. This is not the belief of the ignorant few. It's the worldview of everyone from peasants to princes. King James himself wrote a book on witchcraft, detailing the methods by which witches operate and the ways they can be detected and punished. Learned theologians debate the precise mechanisms by which demonic power operates. Physicians consider whether certain illnesses might be caused by witchcraft rather than natural means. The supernatural is not outside the mainstream of intellectual thought. It's woven through it. For ordinary Londoners, this means living in a world populated by invisible forces, both benevolent and malevolent. You carry charms and amulets to protect yourself from evil influences, a piece of coral around your neck, a hagstone with a natural hole in it, words of scripture written on paper and tucked into your clothing. You avoid certain actions that might attract bad luck or open you to supernatural attack. You notice signs and portents in the natural world, unusual weather, strange animal behaviour, eclipses and comets, that might indicate God's displeasure or coming disaster. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. Horses are believed to be particularly vulnerable to supernatural attack. Hag riding is the term for when a witch rides a horse during the night, leaving it exhausted and sweaty in the morning. Protective charms against this are common in stables. Horseshoes hung above doors, open end up to catch and hold good luck. The hold stones called hagstones hung on strings, bundles of protective herbs. The practical people who work with horses take these precautions seriously. The belief in witchcraft has real and terrible consequences. When things go wrong, when a child sickens unexplainably, when crops fail, when a business collapses, people look for someone to blame, and the witch is a convenient target. Typically, the accused is an older woman, often a widow, often poor, often someone who has quarrelled with her neighbours, or who is seen as difficult or troublesome. The accusation once made is hard to disprove. How do you prove you're not a witch? And the accused often confesses under the pressure of imprisonment, social isolation, and sometimes torture. England doesn't burn witches the way some continental countries do. The English method of execution for convicted witches is hanging, and England's witch trials, while real and numerous, are less deadly than those in Scotland or parts of Germany. But people do die. Historians estimate that perhaps 500 people were executed for witchcraft in England during the 16th and 17th centuries, and many more suffer accusation, imprisonment, and social destruction without ever facing a formal trial. Historians still argue about what drove the witch trials, whether they were primarily about religious anxiety, gender politics, social tensions, or some combination of all these factors. What's clear is that the belief in witchcraft served certain functions. It provided explanations for misfortune, scapegoats for community anger, and a framework for understanding evil that placed it outside the normal community rather than within. The witch was the other, the enemy, the one whose removal would restore order and safety. Not everyone believes equally strongly, of course. Skeptics exist, questioning whether the confessions obtained in witch trials are reliable, whether the evidence presented would stand up to scrutiny, whether the entire phenomenon might be more about human malice than demonic power. These skeptics are a minority, but they represent a current of thought that will eventually prevail. By the early 18th century, the witch trials will have largely ended, victim to changing intellectual fashions as much as any organised campaign against them. You shake off the chill from the old woman's muttering and continue on your way. The docks are ahead, and they represent something quite different from the supernatural concerns we've been discussing. The thoroughly material business of global trade, of ships and goods, and the wealth that flows through this city from every corner of the known world. The smell hits you before you see the river, tar and rope, exotic spices and rotting fish, the particular maritime odour that tells you you're approaching the working waterfront. And then you round a corner and there it is, the Pool of London, the stretch of the Thames just below London Bridge where the great ships anchor, where the wealth of the world flows into England, where you can see the future being unloaded one cargo at a time. Ships crowd the river so thickly that you could almost walk from one bank to the other, stepping from deck to deck. These are not small vessels. Ocean-going merchantmen that have crossed the Atlantic, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, sailed to the distant East Indies and back. Their masts rise like a forest above the wharves, their rigging a web of ropes against the grey sky. Smaller boats swarm among them like insects, ferrying cargo and passengers to and from the shore. The wharves are chaos barely organised. Cranes powered by human muscle hoist bales and barrels from ship holds, swinging them onto the docks where gangs of workers manhandle them into warehouses. Customs officials check manifests, assess duties, stamp papers. Merchants examine their goods, arguing with ship captains about damage and shortages. Sailors just off ships after months at sea spend their wages in the taverns and brothels that cluster along the waterfront. The whole scene is a monument to human enterprise and human appetite. What's being unloaded? Everything. Tobacco from Virginia, in the hogsheads that have become the standard measure of the colonial trade. Sugar from the Caribbean, the sweetness that is transforming English diets and creating fortunes for those willing to engage in the brutal business of plantation slavery. Spices from the East Indies, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, still valuable enough to justify the enormous expense and risk of the voyage. Silk and porcelain from China, cotton from India, wine from France and Portugal, timber from the Baltic. And what's being loaded for export? English cloth, primarily. The woolen textiles that have been England's primary export for centuries and remain the foundation of the nation's wealth. But also manufactures of increasing variety, as English industry begins to produce goods competitive in world markets, and re-exports, goods from one part of the world shipped through England to another, the profits from this carrying trade adding to the city's wealth. Here's something that might surprise you about London's position in world trade. It's not yet dominant. The Dutch, with their smaller country and larger merchant fleet, still control much of European commerce. Dutch ships carry goods between ports that English ships rarely visit. Dutch capital finances ventures that English merchants can't afford. The competition between England and the Netherlands for commercial supremacy will drive much of the century's international conflict. But England is rising, and you can see it here on the docks, the ships getting larger, the cargoes more varied. The reach of English trade extending ever further. The people working these docks are as diverse as the goods they handle. Sailors from every maritime nation, Dutch, Portuguese, Scandinavian, mix with English workers in the polyglot confusion of the waterfront. There are black faces here too, some free sailors working the ships, others enslaved people brought back as curiosities or servants by returning colonists. The empire that England is building will be created by people of many nations and colours, though the profits will flow overwhelmingly to white English merchants. Historians still argue about the role of overseas trade in England's economic development, whether it was a driving force of growth or a relatively small sector that gets disproportionate attention because it left good records. What's clear is that the goods coming through these docks were transforming daily life. The tobacco that became a mass addiction, the sugar that sweetened everything from medicine to breakfast, the tea and coffee that would reshape English drinking habits, the textiles that offered new possibilities of fashion and comfort. You linger on the wharves, watching the endless flow of goods and people. This is where London connects to the wider world, where ideas and diseases and technologies and beliefs all wash in with the tide. The sailors tell stories of lands most Londoners will never see. The goods they unload hint at ways of life impossibly remote. The world is getting smaller, or perhaps getting bigger. It's hard to say which. But the afternoon is advancing and you're feeling the cold. Winter in 17th century London is no joke. And you've been outside too long without adequate protection. Let's explore how people survive the cold months in a city without central heating, and why the frozen Thames can be both a disaster and a celebration. The wind off the river cuts through your clothing like a knife. You huddle into your cloak, or what passes for a cloak in this era, a woolen wrap that provides minimal protection against the bitter cold. Welcome to winter in 17th century London, a season that kills the weak, tests the strong, and transforms the city in ways both terrible and strangely festive. We're in the midst of what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler global temperatures that makes winters in northern Europe significantly harsher than they will be in later centuries. The Thames freezes over regularly, not every year, but often enough that it's a known phenomenon rather than a freak occurrence. When it freezes solid, thick enough to support weight, the ice becomes a fairground, the famous frost fairs that are one of the peculiar delights of this era. But you're not here during a frost fair. You're here during an ordinary winter. An ordinary winter is simply brutal. The houses are heated by open fires, one per floor at most, and the heat they generate barely penetrates the surrounding cold. You wake with ice on the inside of your windows. You can see your breath from the moment you rise until you go to sleep. The streets are frozen mud, treacherous underfoot. The days are short, the nights interminable, and the darkness seems to press in from every side. Clothing is your first line of defence, and you understand now why 17th century people wear so many layers. The linen shirt or shift, the wool stockings, the doublet or bodice, the outer coat or gown, each layer traps air, creating insulation against the cold. The wealthy have fur-lined garments, imported at great expense. Everyone else makes do with wool upon wool, bulk substituting for quality, and still you're cold. Fuel is expensive. London burns coal, shipped down from Newcastle at considerable cost, and a working family might spend a substantial portion of their income just on staying warm. The poor burn whatever they can find, scraps of wood, dung, anything combustible. Fuel theft is common and sometimes tolerated. The authorities understand that frozen corpses are bad for civic morale, but it's still illegal, and people are punished for it. The smoke from all this burning creates the perpetual haze that hangs over the city, worse in winter when every fireplace blazes day and night. Here's a detail about winter that might interest you. The concept of closing down for winter that later centuries will abandon. Some businesses simply don't operate in the coldest months. Construction stops, of course. You can't work with mortar that freezes, but other trades also slow or halt entirely. The agricultural rhythm that still governs much of English life makes winter a time of reduced activity, of waiting out the cold until spring brings renewal. People sleep more, work less, spend more time indoors with family and neighbours. The winter diet is necessarily limited. Fresh vegetables are unavailable. What you eat is whatever was preserved during the harvest: salted meat, dried fish, pickled cabbage, stored roots and grains. The monotony is broken by the occasional feast day, Christmas most notably, which is still celebrated with considerable enthusiasm despite Puritan disapproval. But daily fare is repetitive and often inadequate. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, is not just a sailor's disease. Land dwellers in winter can suffer from it too. The poor suffer disproportionately, as they always do. Those with inadequate housing, insufficient fuel, not enough food, they're the ones who freeze in the streets, who succumb to the respiratory diseases that the cold encourages, who don't make it through to spring. Parish records show elevated mortality in winter months, the steady toll of cold on vulnerable bodies. Children and the elderly are particularly at risk, their resistance lowest when the danger is highest. Historians still argue about how much winter mortality affected population growth in this era. The numbers are significant, perhaps 10 to 15% more deaths in winter months than in summer, but they're offset by other factors. Fewer deaths from plague in cold weather, for instance, since the fleas that spread the disease are less active. The net effect is complicated, and generalizations are risky. And yet, people adapt. They learn to read the weather, to prepare for storms, to stockpile fuel and food against the worst days. They develop social networks that help the vulnerable survive, neighbours checking on each other, parishes distributing fuel to the poorest households. The community pulls together against the common enemy of cold, and somehow most people make it through to the warmth of spring. You hurry towards shelter, your breath misting in the frigid air. The day is fading, and with it, your tour of 17th century London. One more evening remains, a chance to settle in, to reflect on everything you've seen, to let the distant church bells lull you towards sleep and toward your return to your own time. The evening has come at last, a soft blue twilight settling over the rooftops as you make your way back to your lodgings for the final time. The city around you is beginning its transition into night, shopkeepers closing their shutters, taverns filling with workers seeking warmth and company, link boys lighting their torches in preparation for the dark hours ahead. You've spent what feels like a lifetime in 17th century London, though it's only been a day and a night and a day again, and the city has impressed itself upon you in ways you're only beginning to understand. The sounds of London fade gradually as you climb the narrow stairs to your room. The street cries that seemed so overwhelming this morning have become almost familiar. The distinct cadences of vendors selling everything from fish to firewood, from ballads to boot polish. The church bells, which ring on the hour and the quarter hour and for every conceivable occasion, have become a kind of background music marking time in their patient bronze voices. Even the smell, that complex mixture of coal smoke and human habitation, and the river, and 1,000 other sources, has become simply the smell of this place, this moment, this world that is so different from your own. Your room is cold, but someone has laid a fire and you kneel to light it, watching the flames catch and grow. The warmth spreads slowly, pushing back the chill from a small circle around the hearth. You sit there, staring into the fire, letting your mind wander over everything you've witnessed. You've seen a city that was at once brutal and beautiful, dangerous and alive with energy. You've walked streets that ran with filth and visited coffee houses where ideas that would change the world were being born. You've stood among the groundlings at the Globe and watched the heads of traitors rot on London Bridge. You've eaten bread and ale in the morning and roast meat at midday, and felt the peculiar sharpening of thought that coffee brings. You've learned to navigate the hierarchies of clothing and occupation, to read the signs of status and profession that every Londoner displays. The people you've encountered have been recognisably human, worried about the same things people worry about in every era, struggling with the same challenges of survival and meaning and connection. A mother's love for her child is the same in the 1600s as in the 2000s. A merchant's drive for profit, an artist's search for expression, a lover's longing for their beloved. These are constants of human experience that transcend the accidents of time and technology. The 17th century is foreign, but it's not alien. These were people just like you, and yet the differences are profound. The constant presence of death, from plague, from childbirth, from diseases we've conquered and dangers we've eliminated, shaped a worldview that is hard to fully grasp from the safety of modern life. The religious certainty that governed every aspect of existence, the social hierarchies that determined what you could wear and where you could work and who you could marry, the limits on information and travel and possibility that circumscribed every life. These created a mental landscape as different from ours as the physical landscape of unpaved streets and overhanging houses. The fire crackles softly, and you find your eyes growing heavy. The church bells chime the hour. You've lost track of which hour, but it doesn't matter. The night stretches ahead, offering its gift of rest, its promise of the segmented sleep that people have practiced for centuries. You'll drift off soon, wake in the depths of the night, lie quietly while your mind processes everything, then sleep again until morning. Tomorrow, you'll be gone. You'll wake in your own time, in your own bed, surrounded by conveniences that would seem like magic to the people you've been visiting. Hot and cold running water, electric light, antibiotics and anesthesia, information from around the world at your fingertips. You'll take these things for granted, as you always have, but perhaps you'll notice them just slightly more, appreciate them just a little deeper, knowing now what life was like without them. The fire is burning low, and you should add more fuel, but the warmth under the blankets is too precious to leave. You close your eyes instead, letting the sounds of the city, distant now, muffled by walls and darkness, wash over you like a lullaby. A dog barks somewhere. A cart rumbles past. The night watch calls the hour, his voice fading into silence. You think of the child you saw in the doorway, her serious face and small hands. She's sleeping now too, in her own cold room, dreaming whatever dream 17th century children dream. You hope she'll survive childhood, survive the plagues and the fires and the countless dangers of this world, and grow to see the city change around her, become something cleaner and safer and more humane. You hope she'll have children of her own, and grandchildren, and that somewhere in the long chain of generations that stretches from her time to yours, a thread connects you both, the way threads connect all humans across all of time. The night deepens, and the city sleeps, or tries to sleep, or lies awake staring at shadows as humans have always done. The flames in your hearth have settled into glowing embers now, and pulsing with their own soft light, their warmth barely reaching the edges of the room. Outside, the cold presses close, the winter stars wheel overhead, and London dreams its collective dream of commerce and faith and survival. Your breathing slows, your muscles release, your thoughts begin to blur and drift. The sounds fade to whispers, the whispers fade to silence, and you are floating now, suspended between waking and sleeping, between this world and your own. The church bells, distant as memory, chime a time you no longer mark. The night wraps around you like a blanket, like centuries, like the soft dark space between heartbeats. Tomorrow the city will wake and go about its business, unaware that you were ever there. The baker will stoke his oven, the merchants will count their coins. The children will run through streets that will someday be paved with stone and lit with gas and crisscrossed by underground railways. The future is coming, unstoppable, bringing changes that no one in this time can imagine. But that's tomorrow's story. Tonight, there is only rest. Only the quiet crackle of dying embers, the distant rhythm of a city breathing, the gentle weight of blankets against your skin. Your eyes close for the last time on this strange old world, and the darkness welcomes you, warm and soft and boundless, carrying you gently toward whatever comes next. The bells fall silent, the fire fades to ash, and in the deep, still heart of a 17th century night, you let